Section 1. The Griffin Family's Hidden Blueprint. Names, symbols, and the secrets built into the show from day one. Welcome. Pull the blanket up a little closer, find that comfortable spot, and let your breathing slow down. Tonight we are going to go deep into one of the strangest, most layered animated universes ever put on television. A show that has been running since January of 1999. A show that millions of people have grown up with, rewatched on sleepless nights, quoted at kitchen tables, and studied like a text they cannot quite fully decode. We are talking about Family Guy. And not just the jokes you remember, not just the cutaway gags, not just Peter's laugh or Stewie's accent. We are going here to talk about what lives underneath all of that. The patterns hidden so deep in the show's structure that most people have watched hundreds of episodes without ever noticing them. The mysteries that have kept online communities awake for decades. The conspiracies that, the longer you sit with them, start to sound less like the ramblings of bored fans and more like genuine clues left behind by the people who built this world. So let your eyes get heavy. There is no rush. We are going to take this slow, and by the time we are done, you will never quite look at the Griffin family the same way again. Let us start at the beginning. Not the pilot episode, not the first season. Let us go even further back to the actual construction of this world, because the very names the creators chose for these characters are not random. Nothing in a show created by someone as obsessive about detail as Seth MacFarlane is random. Every single name in this show was chosen with a purpose, and when you start pulling on that thread, things get genuinely strange. Peter Griffin. Let us start there. The name Peter comes from the Greek word meaning rock or stone. It is one of the oldest, most foundational names in Western culture. In Christian tradition, Peter was the disciple chosen to be the rock upon which the church was built. He was impulsive, deeply flawed, prone to dramatic failure, and yet was considered essential. He kept stumbling and kept being brought back. Does any of that sound familiar? Peter Griffin stumbles through every episode, destroys everything around him, and yet the show always snaps back, always resets, and Peter remains the foundation. The name is not a coincidence, it is a structural clue. This character was designed from his very name to be the permanent, unmovable center of a world that collapses and rebuilds itself around him endlessly. Now look at the surname, Griffin. In mythology, the griffin is a creature with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle. It is a symbol of strength combined with vision, power fused with the ability to soar above everything else. But here is the contradiction that makes the name so interesting. Peter Griffin is physically large and entirely earthbound. He cannot soar. He barely manages to stand upright sometimes. He is all body and no wings. The name carries this implied promise of greatness, of a being that combines the most powerful land creature with the most powerful aerial creature, and then the actual character is this clumsy, stumbling, deeply average man who cannot get through a Tuesday without breaking something. That gap between what the name suggests and what the character delivers is, when you think about it, the entire joke of Peter Griffin as a concept. He was named after a mythological creature of power and spent 25 years being the opposite of one. Brian Griffin. The name Brian has Celtic origins and carries meanings connected to strength and high ground. In the show, Brian is consistently positioned as the character with the most intellectual and moral elevation, at least in the early seasons. He is the one who reads books, who has literary ambitions, who drinks wine instead of beer, who engages with ideas that the others find inaccessible. He occupies the high ground. He is also, and this is important, a dog. The tension between a name meaning strength and nobility and a character who is literally a domesticated animal is part of the same pattern. The names in this show always carry an expectation that the character is quietly undercut. But Brian shares the family name. He is a griffin in the same way Peter is, which raises the question that fans have been asking for years. What exactly is the Griffin family? What does it mean that a dog and a human and a genius baby and a teenage girl all share this one mythological name? Is the Griffin imagery intentional? Is there something about the Griffin household that the writers were always suggesting operates outside the normal rules of the world? Stewie, short for Stewart. The name Stuart has Scottish origins and historically referred to someone who managed a household, an estate steward, a keeper of order. He was the person responsible for making sure everything ran correctly. Everything. Which is absolutely wild when you consider that Stewie spends the first 3 seasons of the show trying to dismantle the household entirely, to murder his mother and seize control of the planet. He is meant to be the steward, the keeper of order, but he is also the most committed agent of chaos the show has ever produced. The name is either a deeply layered irony or it is something more. Because here is what a lot of people miss. In a strange way, Stewie is the character who does actually understand the household best. He understands the dynamics, the weaknesses, the power structures. His plans fail because of external forces, not because he does not understand what he is working with. He is, in a broken and murderous way, fulfilling the role the name suggests. He is the one paying attention to how everything fits together. Everyone else is just living their lives. Stewie is always watching the machinery. Meg Griffin. The name Meg comes from Margaret, which has Persian roots meaning pearl. A pearl is something small and overlooked that contains genuine beauty and value, something that forms around an irritant, around something painful. The pearl is the oyster's response to something it cannot remove, and what it produces in response to that persistent irritation becomes one of the most valued objects in the world. Meg Griffin is the pearl of the Griffin family. She is the persistent irritant that the family cannot remove, the presence they cannot stop resenting. And yet, in almost every genuinely moving episode the show has produced, she is the one at the center. The emotional weight, the real human pain in this show flows through Meg. She is the pearl. She just has the misfortune of living among people who cannot recognize a pearl when they are holding one. Chris Griffin. Christopher. The name means bearer of Christ, traditionally representing someone who carries something sacred and heavy. Chris carries very little in the conventional sense. He is gentle, aimless, easily confused, and consistently overlooked. But there is this recurring suggestion in the show that Chris has something the others do not. He has moments of genuine artistic insight, a connection to something dreamlike and pure. He talks to the evil monkey in his closet. He has an affinity for the strange. There is a fan theory, one we will get to in depth later, that suggests Chris understands far more about the true nature of his reality than he ever lets on. The boy named for bearing something sacred might actually be carrying a secret the others cannot access. Lois Griffin. Born Lois Pewterschmidt. The name Lois has Greek origins meaning more desirable or superior. She is, by almost every measure the show establishes, the most capable person in the Griffin household. She is the glue, the anchor, the one who could leave and watch everything collapse within days. The maiden name Pewterschmidt is a compound of pewter, the dull gray metal, and the German word Schmid meaning smith, a craftsman who shapes metal. She is the shaper of something dull and gray. She married into the name Griffin, into the mythology of the soaring creature, but she came from a family that works with ordinary material and tries to make something of it. That is Lois in a sentence. She takes the dull gray reality of the Griffin household and tries every single episode to shape it into something functional. Now let us widen the lens, because the names are just the beginning of the blueprint that was embedded into this show from the very first episode. The Griffin house sits at 31 Spooner Street. There is an episode where the address is briefly shown as 72 Spooner Street, which is a continuity error we will talk about at length in a later section, because that inconsistency might actually be more meaningful than a simple mistake. But the canonical address is 31 Spooner Street. Why Spooner Street? A spooner is an archaic term for someone who cuddles. More relevantly, spooning refers to fitting closely together, nested, the way spoons in a drawer lie against each other. A family that is, despite all its chaos and cruelty, fundamentally nested together. Fundamentally unable to operate without each other. They fit, these people, even when they are fighting. Even when Peter is being monstrous, and Meg is suffering, and Brian is making everything worse. They are still on Spooner Street. They are still somehow cuddled up. The address number 31 has been analyzed to death by the fan community, and most of those analyses go nowhere. But there is one observation that keeps coming up and deserves mention. 31 is a prime number, divisible only by itself and 1. It cannot be broken down into smaller parts. It resists reduction. The Griffin family, for all their mess, similarly resists being broken down. Every episode that should logically dissolve them as a unit somehow ends with them intact. They are, structurally, prime, irreducible. The town itself, where they live, has its geography scattered with details that seem almost too carefully placed to be accidental. There is the Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend enormous portions of their lives. A clam that is drunk. A creature that closes itself off from the world, that retreats into its shell, that is rendered vulnerable and open only through intoxication. Peter and his friends at the Drunken Clam are not just socializing. They are, in a very real symbolic sense, creatures who only open up when they are drinking. When sober, they are closed. When drunk, they are accessible. The bar is named after their own emotional condition. There is the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, where Peter works for much of the show's run. Pawtucket is a real city in Rhode Island, which is where the show is set. But the word itself has Algonquian origins, meaning little falls or little waterfall. Peter works at the place of the Little Falls. He is the Little Fall. He keeps falling in every episode, in every season, and the falls are always small enough that he survives them. He is the Pawtucket Patriot in the most literal sense, a patriot, paradoxically, of his own failing. James Woods Regional High School, where the Griffin children attend, is named after the real actor James Woods, who appeared as himself in the show in one of the series' earliest memorable storylines. James Woods, the character, becomes obsessed with Peter and essentially tries to take over his life. Think about the implications of an educational institution being named after a man who becomes a stalker, who develops an unhealthy fixation on the main family. Every Griffin child goes to school in a building named after someone who tried to replace their father. They receive their education in the shadow of their family's most unsettling impersonation story. That is not an accident. That is a joke with very deep roots. The Griffin family dog being named Brian is strange in a way that has bothered fans since the show began. Dogs in fiction are almost never given ordinary Anglo-Saxon first names the same way human characters are. They get names that mark them as animals, as pets, as beings that exist slightly outside the human social contract. But Brian is named as though he is a person, because within the logic of the show, he is. But why specifically Brian? There is a theory, and it is a fascinating one, that Brian is named after Seth MacFarlane's own subconscious self-image. MacFarlane voices Brian using his own natural speaking voice, the one closest to how he actually talks in real life. Peter is performed. Stewie is performed. Quagmire is performed. But Brian is Seth MacFarlane talking. Just talking, without a character voice, without a persona layer. Brian is the most unmediated version of the creator that exists in the show. He is named like a person because to MacFarlane, he is a person. He is the person MacFarlane sees when he looks in the metaphorical mirror, which is why Brian's decline over the later seasons, his transformation into something arrogant and hollow, is arguably the most personal tragedy the show has produced. Before we move on, there is one more piece of this opening section I want to sit with because it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Seth MacFarlane created this show when he was 24 years old. He pitched it when he was 23. He had been out of the Rhode Island School of Design for barely 2 years. He had worked briefly at Hanna-Barbera, contributing to shows like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory. He made 2 short animated films, The Life of Larry and Steve, which were the direct prototypes for Peter and Brian. These shorts showed a dim, heavy-set man named Larry and his intelligent talking dog named Steve. Fox saw these shorts. They gave him a budget and 6 weeks to develop a pilot. He produced a 15-minute presentation. Fox saw it. They ordered the show. What is remarkable about this, when you slow down and really think about it, is that the entire cosmology of this show, the entire architecture, the names, the town, the family structure, the mythology buried in every detail, came from the mind of a 23-year-old man who was, by all accounts, barely sleeping and working around the clock. The details that we have spent this section analyzing were not the result of years of careful planning. They emerged from someone working at a fever pitch, under enormous pressure, drawing on everything they had absorbed from 2 decades of consuming animation, literature, film, and comedy. The blueprint was not drawn slowly. It was poured. And somehow in that pour, all of these patterns emerged. Whether they were conscious choices or unconscious ones almost does not matter. They are there. They can be read. And once you start reading them, you cannot stop. Now, if you are watching this in the late hours, with the room getting darker and your thoughts getting softer, drop a comment down below. Tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I love knowing that somewhere someone is listening to this at 3 in the morning in one country while someone else is catching it on a lunch break in another. And if you have not subscribed yet, please consider doing that right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a lot more of this kind of deep, slow exploration to come. Now settle back in. We are just getting started. Section 2. The Dark Geography, a town that should not exist. Rhode Island is the smallest state in the United States. It has an area of roughly 1,214 square miles, which makes it smaller than many American cities. It has about 1 million people. It has a coastline on the Atlantic Ocean, significant history in the American Revolution, a rich textile and manufacturing past, and a handful of genuinely famous cities. Providence is the capital. Newport is known for its Gilded Age mansions and its sailing culture. Pawtucket, which gives its name to Peter's Brewery, is a real post-industrial city just north of Providence. And then there's the town where the Griffin family lives, a fictional place called, in the show, Quahog. Except in this script, because of the way we approach things here, we are going to call it something else. We are going to call it the town. Because the town where the Griffins live is, when you examine it with any degree of seriousness, one of the strangest places ever constructed in the history of animated fiction. And the strangeness is not accidental, it is built in. A quahog, for those who do not know, is a species of hard clam found along the Atlantic coast of North America. It is the dominant shellfish in New England's coastal waters. It is thick-shelled, slow-moving, and can live for extraordinarily long periods. Some quahog clams have been documented living for over 500 years. They are among the longest-lived animals on Earth. Scientists can count the growth rings inside their shells, like tree rings, and determine the clam's age with extraordinary precision. The oldest quahog ever found and verified was an ocean quahog named Ming, which was determined to be 507 years old when it was accidentally killed during the process of studying it. Let that sit for a moment. The town where the Griffins live is named after an animal that lives for 500 years, that measures its lifespan in centuries, that keeps meticulous biological records of every year it has endured. And the Griffins have been living in this town since 1999, and none of them have aged a day. Not Peter, not Lois, not Meg, or Chris. Stewie remains perpetually 1 year old across more than 25 years of episodes. The town is named for an immortal creature, and its most prominent residents are functionally immortal. They never age, they reset. They endure. The geography of the town is, when mapped using the internal evidence from the show itself, genuinely inconsistent in ways that go beyond normal animation continuity errors. The houses change positions relative to each other. The drunken clam seems to exist in at least 2 different locations, depending on which episode you are watching. There have been at least 2 distinct versions of the Griffin house's interior layout. Streets appear and disappear. Distances between familiar locations shift dramatically. There is a fan theory, and it is one of the most structurally coherent theories in the entire Family Guy discourse, that the geography of the town is inconsistent because the town is not a fixed physical place. It is a dream space, a mental construct that has different geography depending on who is dreaming it, or what mental state the dreamer is in during a given episode. Under this theory, the spatial inconsistencies are not errors. They are confirmations. The place where the Griffins live reconfigures itself between episodes? Because it is not a place in the conventional sense. It is a projection. This would explain something that has puzzled fans for years. The town seems to contain a remarkable number of institutions, landmarks, and businesses for a small Rhode Island city. There is a giant mall, multiple hospitals, an amusement park, a nuclear power plant, a military base, the aforementioned high school, a courthouse, multiple churches, a television station where Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons broadcast the local news, a brewery, multiple bars, a city hall presided over for years by Mayor Adam West, and at least one functioning prison that Peter has visited multiple times. This is infrastructure that a mid-sized American city would strain to support. For a small New England coastal town of indeterminate size, it is physically implausible. But in a dream space, infrastructure appears as needed. The court appears when court is required. The prison appears when imprisonment is narratively necessary. The amusement park appears when the story calls for an amusement park. The town does not maintain all of these things simultaneously in the way a real city would. They exist in superposition, collapsing into reality when the story demands them. Consider the nuclear power plant. It appears occasionally, usually when a plot requires a dangerous industrial setting. It has no consistent location relative to the residential neighborhoods. It does not appear to affect the town's economy, ecology, or public health in any of the ways an actual nuclear facility would. It is simply there when it needs to be there, which is an extraordinarily convenient property for a nuclear power plant to have, and an entirely ordinary property for a dreamed location to have. There is also the matter of Mayor Adam West. The real Adam West, who gave his voice and his name and his remarkable comedic sensibility to this character, passed away in June of 2017. The character of Mayor Adam West existed in the show for many seasons as this peculiar, disconnected, possibly genuinely unwell civic leader whose decisions seemed to operate entirely outside conventional logic. He would declare war on the number 7. He would mistake a CAT scan for a real cat. He would engage in elaborate schemes that had no apparent political motivation and produce no discernible results. His governance of the town, to the extent that it can be called governance, was an exercise in sustained non sequitur. He was the mayor of a dream place, and he governed the way a mayor would govern in a dream. Nothing connected. Nothing followed from anything else. His authority was entirely performative and entirely accepted. After Adam West's death, the show addressed the mayor's passing in a genuinely moving episode, which is notable because the show does not always handle its real-world losses with sensitivity. But the fact that Mayor West's death was felt in the show as a real loss, as a weight, suggests something about how the show's creators understood his role. He was not just a recurring guest character. He was the genius loci of the place, the spirit of the location. When he died, the town lost something irreplaceable, something that had defined its dreamlike quality. The town also has a peculiar relationship with time, which connects to something we will explore extensively in a later section. But for now, note this. The show is set in a version of the present that has always been the present. When the show first aired in 1999, it was set in 1999. When it aired in 2010, it was set in 2010. When it airs today, it is set today. The characters make reference to contemporary culture, technology, political figures, and events. But the children never age, the parents never age, the houses stay the same. This creates a temporal paradox that the show acknowledges and jokes about, but never resolves. The town exists in a perpetual contemporary moment, always now, never then, never next. It is a place without a past or a future in the conventional sense. It is always happening. There is one location in the town that deserves special attention, and it is one that almost no one outside the hardcore fan community ever stops to think about. The Griffin's house at 31 Spooner Street sits on a street. That street is part of a neighborhood. The neighborhood has neighbors. Joe Swanson lives next door. Cleveland Brown lived in the house directly across the street before moving to his own spin-off show. Glenn Quagmire lives a few doors down. This is the most improbable concentration of close male friends in any animated comedy. 4 men who are each other's primary social companions all happen to live within shouting distance of each other. Not in the same apartment complex, not in the same building, independently choosing homes on the same suburban street with their families. In the real world, the probability of four adult men who are best friends all independently selecting homes within 100 yards of each other is vanishingly small. But in the dream space theory, this is not strange at all. The geography arranges itself to serve the emotional needs of the central figure. If the central figure of the dream space needs his friends close, they will be close. The street configures itself to house everyone who matters. Distance is not a factor in a place where distance is a function of emotional relevance. There is also the evil monkey who lives in Chris Griffin's closet. This character, who appears periodically throughout the earlier seasons as a recurring joke, is exactly what it sounds like. A monkey living in a closet in a suburban home in Rhode Island. Who points at Chris in a menacing and accusatory way whenever Chris opens the closet? The evil monkey was eventually given a backstory in a later episode, which explained his anger and pointed accusation as the response to a romantic betrayal. His wife left him. He never recovered. Every time he points at Chris, he is not actually threatening Chris. He is still pointing at the ghost of his failed marriage. This is a beautiful piece of hidden storytelling. The monster in the child's closet is not a monster. It is a heartbroken primate processing a divorce. The thing that Chris Griffin fears in the dark, the accusatory finger pointing out of the shadows, the thing that makes him afraid to open the closet, is grief. It is someone else's grief, stored in a small dark space, emerging periodically to gesture at the world with everything it has lost. And that, genuinely, is one of the most emotionally resonant things this show has ever done. And it was smuggled in as a background joke that most people took at face value for years. The geography of the town is also notable for what it does not have. It has no visible public transit, no visible grocery infrastructure that the characters actually use in a consistent way. No visible school for Stewie, despite Stewie occasionally attending one. No visible university for Brian to attend, despite Brian talking about his university years. The institutions that define life in a real city exist in this place as a kind of background hum, always implied, never quite visible. You know there is a grocery store because the Griffins have food. You know there is a university because Brian has opinions. But you never see the supply chain that produces these things. The town has results without processes. Things appear without being obtained. This is, again, exactly how a dream functions. You have what you need in a dream without having acquired it through any sequence of cause and effect. One final element of the town's geography that deserves mention. There is the ocean. The town is coastal, and the ocean is visible from certain vantage points, and the Griffins have occasionally adventured onto it or into it. The ocean in this show functions as the boundary of the known world. Things that come from the ocean are strange. Things that happen on the ocean are unpredictable. The ocean is where the town's dream logic becomes most transparent. The rules are different out there, and given that the town is named after a creature that lives in the ocean floor, that begins its life as a seed drifting through deep water, the ocean is not just a geographical feature. It is the source. It is where the logic of this place comes from. The deep, slow, 500-year patience of the quahog clam is the heartbeat of this world, slow and ancient and indifferent to human time. The town is strange. The town was always strange. And everything that happens inside it carries the weight of a place that is fundamentally not quite real. Section 3. Peter Griffin is not who he thinks he is. Let us talk about the man at the center of everything. The fat, drunk, well-meaning, occasionally monstrous, perpetually childlike figure who somehow holds the entire cosmology of this show together through the sheer gravitational weight of his presence. Peter Griffin. And specifically the extraordinary number of layers of identity, falsity, and hidden history that the show has accumulated around this character over its run. Start with the biological reality. This is not a theory. This is established canonical fact within the show's mythology. Peter Griffin was not born as Peter Griffin. His birth name, according to the episode Quagmire's Mom, is Justin Peter Griffin. He was born in Mexico City, not in Rhode Island. His mother, Thelma, was in Mexico attempting to obtain an abortion when the pregnancy was too advanced to terminate, and Peter was born prematurely in a medical facility there. Thelma then brought him back to Rhode Island, where she had never filed the appropriate documentation to establish Peter's citizenship. This means, as the episode Padre de Familia explores, that Peter Griffin spent the first several decades of his life as an undocumented immigrant in the country he loves, with an almost aggressive patriotism. The man who drinks American beer and waves American flags and cheers American football teams was, technically, not an American for most of his life, because his mother never filed the paperwork. Then there is the father situation, which we touched on in the opening section, but which deserves its full examination here. The man Peter grew up calling his father, the man who raised him with a combination of emotional distance, religious rigidity, and genuine, if unexpressed care, was Francis Griffin. A devout Irish-American Catholic, a man who was demanding and often cruel in his emotional withholding, but who did, in his way, show up. Francis raised Peter. Francis is the father of Peter's psychological landscape, the source of his Catholic guilt, his complicated relationship with authority, his need for approval from men he respects. But Francis was not Peter's biological father. Peter's biological father is a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irishman who Thelma met on a trip to Ireland. Mickey is, in the show's own description, a town drunk. He is overweight, loud, prone to drinking contests, happy-go-lucky, completely irresponsible, and immediately recognizable as Peter's genetic blueprint. When Peter first meets Mickey, in the episode Peter's Two Dads from Season 5, the resemblance is so powerful that the bond between them is instant. Peter does not need a paternity test. He challenges Mickey to a drinking contest and wins, and Mickey accepts this as proof of parentage because only a member of his own bloodline could beat him at drinking. Think about what this means for Peter's entire psychology. He spent his whole life being shaped by a man, Francis, who was hard on him, who withheld love, who imposed discipline and religious expectation, who told him he was not good enough. And the reason Peter never quite met Francis's standards, the reason there was always this chafing mismatch between what Francis wanted and what Peter was, is that Peter was not actually Francis's son. He was Mickey's son. He had Mickey's genetics, Mickey's appetites, Mickey's way of moving through the world. And Francis knew this, or suspected it, and spent decades holding Peter at arm's length for exactly that reason. The emotional estrangement of Peter's entire childhood was not arbitrary cruelty. It was the particular cruelty of a man raising a child he had not fathered, trying to impose his own values on someone built entirely from another man's blueprint. This makes Peter Griffin's entire trajectory, his transformation from the person Francis tried to make him into to the person Mickey actually made him, a biographical arc that spans the entire show. The question of which father wins, the one who raised him or the one who made him, is answered a little more each season as Peter becomes less like the cautious, rule-following, family-oriented Catholic father figure and more like the drinking, laughing, consequences-be-damned Irishman who conceived him in what the show describes as a porta potty at a bullfighting event in Mexico. None of which is particularly flattering to anyone involved, but all of which is thematically coherent in a way that the show rarely gets credit for. Now here is where the theories begin. Because the canonical backstory is strange enough, but there is a fan theory that takes the identity mystery even further. And it is one of the most thoroughly constructed theories in the Family Guy community. The theory, which has circulated in various forms across forums and fan wikis for years, is called the Peter in Purgatory theory, or sometimes the Peter's breakdown theory. It holds that the events of Family Guy, or at least a significant portion of them, are not real. They are the internal experience of a man who has suffered an irreversible psychological break from reality, and who now lives in an elaborate mental construct that allows him to cope with a catastrophic event in his past. The theory goes like this. Peter Griffin, the real Peter Griffin, was involved in a serious drunk driving accident. In this accident, Meg was driving the car, having been encouraged or pressured to do so by Peter, and the car crashed. Chris and Lois were killed. Lois was pregnant with Stewie at the time of the accident. The unborn Stewie did not survive. Meg survived but was severely traumatized, blamed for the accident, and never recovered emotionally. Peter, driven to the edge of sanity by guilt, grief, and the collapse of everything he had built, created an internal world. In this world, everyone is alive, his family is intact, but his unconscious guilt has reshaped them. Lois is alive, but she is often cold, distant, capable of cruelty that the real Lois would never have exhibited. Peter's subconscious punishes him by making the Lois in his dream world less than the Lois he lost. Chris is alive but is profoundly dim, reduced in intelligence, as though Peter's mind cannot quite fully reconstruct a child he knew only briefly before the accident. They say survivor of the accident, and therefore in Peter's mind the cause of the accident, is treated with open contempt and hostility by everyone in the Dream family because Peter's subconscious has never forgiven her for being behind the wheel. And Stewie. Stewie was never born. He died with Lois in the accident. So in Peter's constructed reality, the unborn Stewie is given the life Peter always believed he had the potential for. He is a genius. He is articulate. He is powerful. He is everything an unborn child, carried by a woman Peter loved desperately, might have been in a father's dreams. Peter makes Stewie brilliant because he has to. Stewie represents the potential that was erased before it could be realized. Brian exists in this framework as the one stable thing. The dog was real. The dog survived. Brian, the actual animal who actually lived at 31 Spooner Street, is the anchor between the dream world and the real one. He can communicate with Stewie because the dream version of Brian is Peter's way of keeping the real Brian present. The dog is the bridge. He talks because Peter needs him to talk, needs someone in this internal world to be as real as the actual animal is. This theory explains Peter's increasingly erratic and often genuinely cruel behavior across the show's run. In the early seasons, when the dream world is newly constructed and Peter's guilt is at its most acute, he is more careful. He is more loving. He is more aware of what he has lost. As the seasons progress, as the construct becomes more elaborate and Peter retreats further into it, the dream figures become distorted. Peter stops taking care of them the way he would have taken care of the real versions. He begins to act out against them. He hurts the dream family because the real family is beyond his reach, and the grief has nowhere else to go. The theory has been around long enough to accumulate a significant amount of counter-evidence, and we should acknowledge that. There are plenty of episodes that contradict specific aspects of it. The show's continuity is flexible enough that any internal theory can find both support and contradiction. But what the theory does beautifully is provide a framework for understanding the show's emotional register. Why is there always this undercurrent of sadness beneath the comedy? Why do the characters seem to be living in a place that is almost right, but not quite right? Why does the world keep resetting, keep refusing to change permanently, keep returning to the same baseline configuration regardless of what happens? Because the man dreaming it needs it to stay the same. Because change means the dream might end, and the dream ending means facing whatever is on the other side of it. There is another layer to Peter's identity that does not require a conspiracy theory because it is right there in the canon. Peter Griffin is also biologically connected through a bloodline the show explores in the episode Untitled Griffin Family History to an enslaved man named Nate Griffin who lived in the 19th century. Nate is depicted in the episode as a slave on a plantation, and the episode follows a long lineage of Griffin ancestors through history, all of them bearing Peter's face and Peter's approximate personality, moving through different eras. This is an unusual creative choice, and it means something. The show is saying, through its mythology, that Peter's particular way of being in the world, his specific combination of foolishness and resilience and appetite and occasional surprising courage is not a personal failing. It is a genetic inheritance. It is old. It has survived slavery, poverty, war, and the grinding machinery of history. Whatever Peter is, he has always been it. And whatever he is has always survived. This connects to something fascinating in the Peter mythology. He is, despite everything, indestructible. He falls off buildings, drives cars into walls, gets beaten in extended combat sequences, survives explosions, suffers injuries that should be permanently debilitating, and appears in the next scene completely unscathed. This is played as comedy, as is standard for animated shows. But in the context of his lineage, in the context of the Nate Griffin bloodline that has survived centuries of extraordinary difficulty, it reads as something more. Peter Griffin cannot be permanently damaged because he is made of something that cannot be permanently damaged. He is the end product of an unbroken chain of survival. The comedy of his indestructibility is built on a foundation that is actually about something. The fat man in the green shorts is, in the longest possible view, a survivor. He comes from a line of survivors, and no matter what the show throws at him, the survival continues. Peter's other identity mysteries include the question of his actual intelligence. The show is deeply inconsistent about how smart Peter is. In the early seasons, he is dim but functional. He holds a job. He navigates social situations with a rough but recognizable competence. He makes decisions that are often bad but are at least decisions, arrived at through some kind of reasoning process. As the seasons continue, his intelligence drops to a point where he seems genuinely incapable of processing basic information. He cannot read sometimes, which contradicts earlier episodes where he reads fine. He fails to understand concepts that he mastered in previous storylines. There is a theory that this is not the show being lazy, though the show is certainly also being lazy. The theory is that Peter's intelligence degradation is a function of the dream world. As the internal construct becomes more elaborate and more detached from reality, the cognitive architecture that holds it together begins to show strain. The Peter of the later seasons is not dumber because the writers gave up on him, though they did. He is dumber because the man constructing this reality from the inside is getting further from the anchor of genuine consciousness. The dream is degrading at its center, and the center of the dream is Peter. His relationship with Lois, throughout all of this, carries a particular emotional weight. In the early seasons, the love between Peter and Lois is the most real thing in the show. You believe it. You feel the affection beneath the dysfunction. You can see that whatever else is broken in this household, these two people genuinely chose each other and genuinely mean something to each other. As the seasons progress, that foundation is tested more and more severely. Peter does things to Lois that no loving husband would do. Lois responds with a coldness that early Lois would never have shown. The relationship frays, but it never breaks. And every time it seems to break, something pulls it back together. Under the grief and guilt theory, this makes complete sense. Peter's mind will not allow the relationship to end, because the relationship ending in the dream world is the closest thing to the relationship ending in reality. Lois dying in the accident was the event that shattered everything. The dream keeps the relationship intact because to lose Dream, Lois would be to lose everything twice. The relationship is protected by something more powerful than narrative convention. It is protected by Peter's fundamental need to hold on to what he lost. Section 4, Stewie's True Nature, the baby who sees everything. There is a particular kind of person who, the first time they watch Family Guy, becomes immediately and intensely fixated on Stewie Griffin. Not on the jokes, exactly. The jokes are funny. The accent, the vocabulary, the contrast between infant appearance and Bond villain ambition, all of it is genuinely funny. But what hooks certain people, particularly people who tend to think in systems and structures, is the feeling that Stewie knows something, that he sees something, that his awareness of the world he inhabits operates on a completely different level than everyone else's, and that this is not just played for comedy. It is actually true within the show's internal logic. Let us establish what we know about Stewie Griffin factually before we get into the stranger territory. He is chronologically 1 year old. He speaks with a received pronunciation British accent in elaborate, sophisticated sentences. His vocabulary is demonstrably the largest of any character on the show. He builds functional advanced technology including time machines, mind control devices, weather manipulation equipment, and various weapons in his bedroom. He is physically strong in a way that is inconsistent with his size and age. He has a complex inner life that includes genuine philosophical reflection, creative ambition, and deep emotional attachment. He is, by any measure, an extraordinary being. The question that the show has been wrestling with since its first episode, and has never satisfyingly answered, is whether Stewie is actually what he appears to be within the show's world, or whether something else is going on. And there are two major competing theories, both of which have enough evidence to be taken seriously, and which together create a kind of double vision about the character that makes him endlessly fascinating. The first theory, which originated in a Reddit thread that has since been cited, discussed, and built upon for years, is that the entire show takes place inside Stewie's mind. That the events of Family Guy are, quite literally, Stewie's perception of the world around him. That what we see when we watch the show is a baby's interpretation of his environment, filtered through the extraordinary intelligence that Stewie possesses, which has constructed an elaborate and internally consistent narrative from the raw material of infant experience. Under this theory, Peter is not actually stupid. He is a fully functional adult male who happens to be, from a baby's perspective, enormous, physically powerful, and impenetrable in his adult logic. Babies cannot follow adult reasoning. They see adult men as essentially unpredictable forces of nature who do things for reasons that make no sense, who sometimes carry them and sometimes put them down, who sometimes laugh and sometimes raise their voices, who operate according to social rules that are completely opaque to an infant. Stewie's mind has interpreted this as stupidity, because stupid is the closest concept he has for someone whose reasoning he cannot follow. Lois is strict. She is the disciplinarian. She is the one who interrupts what Stewie wants to do, who removes things from his reach, who insists on schedules and limitations. In the show, she is Stewie's arch-enemy. She is the one he wants to kill. And from the perspective of an infant who has no framework for understanding why a loving parent imposes limits, the parent who imposes the most limits would be experienced as the most hostile presence. Lois is not evil. But from inside a baby's raw experience, someone who constantly tells you no, who interrupts your desires with her own agenda, who is physically larger than you and therefore impossible to resist, would feel like an enemy. Brian talks under this theory because Stewie understands Brian as a member of the family who communicates. Dogs communicate with humans in a rich and constant way that most humans decode as tail wags and whimpers, but that, from a very young child's perspective before they have learned to differentiate, might feel like language. Brian barks. Brian makes sounds. Brian responds to Stewie's sounds. From inside Stewie's experience, this is a conversation. The show externalizes what is, in reality, an infant understanding a dog as a communication partner and inventing the content of that communication from his own extraordinary internal monologue. This would also explain why some characters can understand Stewie and others cannot, which is one of the most frequently cited inconsistencies in the show. Early Stewie is understood by almost nobody. Later, Stewie seems to be understood by everyone at certain moments, and by nobody at others. Under the Stewie's mind theory, the variations in who understands him reflect Stewie's own fluctuating confidence in whether his communications are reaching others. Sometimes he believes he is being understood. Sometimes he does not. The show reflects his belief, not the external reality. The second major theory about Stewie is almost the inverse of the first. Rather than Stewie being an infant whose imagination has constructed the show's world, this theory holds that Stewie is not an infant at all. He is a fully formed, highly advanced being who is experiencing something like an extended human childhood as part of an agenda that has not yet been fully revealed. The evil genius aspect of early Stewie, under this reading, was not a joke. It was not a bit. It was the actual, literal truth. Stewie Griffin was a real threat to the established order. He was genuinely planning world domination. He genuinely wanted to kill Lois, not out of an Oedipal complex, but because Lois represented a specific obstacle in his path. What happened to derail this? The softening of Stewie's character, the gradual retreat from villainy into emotional complexity, is usually attributed to the writer's creative choices. But some theorists suggest it reflects something that happened within the show's world. Stewie was not softened by the writers. He was changed by something. His relationship with Brian, his growing emotional investment in the Griffin household, his development of genuine attachments, these things are not character development in the Hollywood sense. They are the results of a process of domestication. Stewie the supervillain was tamed. By a dog. By a family he could not stop caring about. By a world that was too small and too warm and too attached to him to allow him to remain purely destructive. This theory suggests that the moment Stewie truly ceased to be a threat was not a specific episode. It was gradual and inevitable. The first time Stewie genuinely laughed at something Brian said. The first time he let himself be comforted by Lois even as he plotted against her. The first time he chose to spend time with the family instead of working on a scheme. Each of these moments was a small defeat for the supervillain and a small victory for the human, or whatever Stewie is, something that learned to be human by osmosis. There is a third dimension of Stewie's nature that the show has gestured at without ever fully committing to: his relationship to time. Stewie's time machine is one of the show's most important recurring elements. It has been destroyed, rebuilt, broken, and used across many seasons. The time travel episodes featuring Stewie and Brian are among the most technically ambitious things the show has attempted. And what is striking when you trace all of these episodes is how consistently the rules of time travel in this show favor Stewie. He is uniquely positioned to move through time in ways that other characters are not. When something needs to be reset, when a consequence needs to be undone, Stewie or someone using Stewie's technology is the solution. He is the character who has access to undo. Under the Stewie as extraordinary being theory, this is not a coincidence. Stewie built his time machine because he understood on some level that he would need it. That the world he was entering was one where catastrophic things would happen and where the ability to move backward and forward through time would be the only way to protect what he came to care about. The death and resurrection of Brian is the clearest example. Stewie destroys his time machine, makes himself unable to undo events, and then spends 2 episodes in a world without Brian before finding a way to recover the technology and fix what was broken. He built the undo button because he knew he would eventually need it. He just did not know yet what he would need to undo. One element of Stewie's characterization that deserves specific attention is his British accent. Nobody in his immediate family has a British accent. Lois comes from a wealthy, old-money New England family. Peter is Irish-American working class. Neither of them has any particular connection to British culture or speech patterns. Chris has a generic American accent. Meg has a generic American accent. The dog speaks in Seth MacFarlane's natural California voice, and Stewie speaks like a particularly educated Londoner from an earlier era. There is a charming fan theory about this that does not require any elaborate conspiracy. It holds that Stewie has a British accent because Lois has a British accent, specifically a suppressed one. The theory suggests that Lois grew up in a wealthy family that aspired to a certain transatlantic refinement in the mid-20th century sense. A kind of cultivated speech pattern that upper-class East Coast Americans once affected to sound more educated and European. She lost this accent or suppressed it at some point in her adult life, but it persisted in her speech patterns when she was alone or when she was talking to herself. And Stewie, who was in the womb while Lois talked to herself in her real voice, absorbed the cadence of that hidden accent before he was born. The British accent is Lois's secret self, externalized in the child she did not know was listening. This theory has a beautiful emotional logic. Lois Pewterschmidt grew up rich, suppressed her authentic self to marry the man she loved, and the most intimate version of who she was before all the accommodation got preserved in her youngest child's voice. Stewie is Lois's hidden self, walking around and talking in her secret accent, completely unaware that the voice he uses is not his own, but his mother's. There is also the question of Stewie's weapons. The show establishes that Stewie builds functional advanced technology in his bedroom, and this has always been treated as a running gag. But the gag has a specific quality. The weapons are real, they work. In early episodes, they are used, they affect the world. Stewie shoots people with his ray gun and they fall down. He uses his mind control devices and they control minds. The weapons are not props, they are part of the show's internal reality. Which means that whatever Stewie is, he is something capable of building technology that the rest of the human world in this show cannot. He is not imagining the weapons. He is actually producing them from materials he obtains. And in a normal Rhode Island house with normal parents and limited access to anything beyond a standard infant's environment, this suggests that Stewie has resources and abilities that are, within the show's own logic, genuinely supernatural. The slow retirement of the weapons is one of the show's unacknowledged tragedies. As Stewie became softer, the weapons became rarer. The lab became less prominent. The elaborate devices showed up less frequently. By the later seasons, the time machine is essentially the only technology Stewie deploys with any regularity. All the rest has been packed away. The supervillain has been domesticated. The arsenal has been quietly retired. The most dangerous being in the Griffin house spends his time going on adventures with a dog and processing his feelings. And somewhere in his bedroom, beneath the toys and the sippy cups, the ray guns gather dust. It is worth considering what this says if we read it as metaphor. Every person who might have been something extraordinary, who had the tools and the intelligence and the will to reshape the world, makes compromises, forms attachments, finds that the small world in front of them is more compelling than the large ambition behind them. Stewie could have conquered everything. He chose to love Brian instead. And depending on your perspective, that is either the most human thing in the show or its greatest failure. Section 5. Brian Griffin, the saddest secret on television. Let us talk about the dog. Specifically, let us talk about all the things the dog was and all the things the dog became. Because the story of Brian Griffin is, when you hold it up to the light and look at it carefully, one of the most quietly devastating character studies in the history of animated television. It is devastating not because the writers intended to devastate you. Most of the time, the writers were probably not thinking this hard about it. It is devastating because of the gap between who Brian was at the beginning and what he had become by the middle of the show's run. And because that gap maps onto something real about the way people change when they stop being honest with themselves. Start with the foundational mystery. Brian Griffin is a dog. He walks on two legs, drinks martinis, drives a car, engages in long philosophical conversations, maintains long-term relationships, and in every observable respect functions as a human male of approximately middle age and middling success. He lives with a human family as their pet, theoretically, but the relationship is more complicated than that. He is Peter's best friend. He is Stewie's intellectual companion. He is part of the family in a way that no actual dog could be, because no actual dog has Brian's capacity for self-reflection and for making other people miserable with unsolicited opinions. The show offers exactly two canonical explanations for Brian's nature, and they contradict each other. In one early episode, Brian's backstory is told through a flashback sequence that shows Peter discovering a young Brian begging on the side of the road, taking him in and eventually adopting him as the family dog. In this version, Brian's intelligence and speech are simply there, unexplained, a given of his nature, part of what Peter saw when he picked him up. In a later episode, the origins shift slightly, and Brian is described as having been raised essentially as a human child from birth, given a human upbringing that explains his human behavior. Neither of these fully satisfies the mystery of what Brian actually is, which is why a particularly wild fan theory, one that circulates in various forms online, suggests that Brian is not a dog who acts human. He is a human who is trapped in a dog's body, specifically a human whose brain was placed into a dog by the CIA. This is clearly inspired by the character of Klaus in American Dad, where a German man's consciousness is placed into a goldfish by that show's version of the CIA. The theory suggests that Brian and Klaus are two sides of the same coin. Both are consciousnesses that have been displaced into animal bodies. Both are struggling with the limitations of their physical form. Both maintain their original identity through force of will. The difference is that Klaus knows what he is and is openly processing the tragedy of his displacement, while Brian has been in the dog's body long enough that he has half forgotten what he used to be. His alcoholism is not a character quirk. It is a coping mechanism for an existential horror that he cannot quite name because he no longer fully remembers what he lost. This is a very dark place to go with a cartoon dog, and it is probably not what the writers intended. But the resonance is there. Brian drinks to blunt something. He reaches for intellectual identity, for writerly ambition, for romantic achievement, with a desperation that goes beyond normal human ambition. He is hungry for recognition in a way that suggests he is trying to recover something. A status or a significance that he had once and cannot quite reclaim in his current form. The Brian as Seth MacFarlane theory is much more grounded and much more supported by the evidence. MacFarlane voices Brian in his natural speaking voice. Not a performed voice, not a character voice, his actual voice. When MacFarlane speaks in interviews as himself, he sounds like Brian. This is not a coincidence. Brian is the part of MacFarlane that is most directly externalized in the show. The failed writer who wants to be taken seriously, the liberal intellectual who drinks too much, The romantic who keeps choosing wrong, the man who is smarter than most of the people around him and is not entirely graceful about it. All of this is self-portrait, which means that the deterioration of Brian's character over the show's middle and later seasons is, on some level, MacFarlane watching a version of himself go wrong and choosing to keep showing it anyway. The Brian who becomes arrogant, who treats people around him with contempt, who loses the genuine intelligence and replaces it with performative pretension, who makes decision after decision that no decent person would make, and who does all of this while continuing to talk about his own moral and intellectual superiority, is a particularly uncomfortable self-study. Either MacFarlane was worried about becoming this person and writing Brian as a warning, or he did not notice what he was doing and stumbled into an accidental self-critique, or the writers in the room who were given Brian to work with made choices that MacFarlane did not fully supervise, and which took the self-portrait into territory he would not have chosen. The death of Brian in Season 12 is the point where all of this comes into sharpest focus. The episode Life of Brian aired in November of 2013. In it, Stewie's time machine has been destroyed. A car strikes Brian in the street while they are playing hockey. Brian is rushed to the vet. He dies. The Griffin family gathers around him, and in a scene that is completely devoid of the show's usual irony and comedy, they grieve. The grief is real. The loss is treated as a genuine loss. There are no jokes. There is no cutaway. There is just the family standing around the bed where the dog is dying, and then the dog is dead. The fan response was, by every account, genuinely extreme. Online petitions demanded Brian's return. Social media exploded. People who had been casually watching the show for years found themselves upset in a way that surprised them. Seth MacFarlane described the reaction as startling. The production team had expected some response. They did not expect the rage. They had not understood how deeply people cared about this particular character. 2 episodes later, Brian came back. Stewie, encountering a past version of himself in a toy store, convinced his past self to give him a time device and used it to go back to the moment before the accident and pull Brian out of the street. Brian returned. Everything reset. The grief was undone. The discourse that followed the resurrection fell into 2 camps. The first camp said this was cheap, that the show had manipulated the audience's emotions for a rating stunt, and then immediately canceled the emotional check it had written. The second camp said this was actually the point, that the show was demonstrating something about grief and denial and the refusal to accept loss, and that Stewie's desperate use of forbidden technology to undo Brian's death was one of the most genuinely moving things the show had ever done. Both of these readings have merit, but there's a third reading that the fan community has arrived at more slowly. Brian's death was meant to be permanent. The original plan, if such a plan existed, was that Brian would stay dead. Vinny, the replacement dog voiced by the late Tony Sirico, would become the new family dog. The show would be different. The writers would be forced to find a new dynamic, a new center of gravity. And then the fan response came in and the decision was reversed. What this means is that Brian Griffin survived his own death because people loved him too much to let him go. Not because the story required it, because the audience refused to allow the show to proceed without him. This is genuinely unusual. Characters come back from the dead in fiction all the time, but usually because the narrative requires it, or because a producer made a business decision. Brian came back because the emotional bond between the audience and the character overrode what the story was trying to do. He was resurrected by love. And that is a strange and wonderful thing to be able to say about a cartoon dog. What the resurrection also did was confirm something about what Brian means. He is not just a character in a show. He is a relationship that millions of people have formed over many years. He is the character who feels most like someone you might actually know, most like someone who has actually sat across from you and made you feel understood even as they were being annoying. He is the friend who is infuriating but irreplaceable. And when the show tried to remove him, it discovered that the audience had no interest in a version of the show where that relationship was absent. The show could get worse in every other way. The audience would tolerate it, but take away Brian and they rebelled. Brian's alcoholism is one of the show's most consistent and most underanalyzed running threads. It is played as a joke. The dog who drinks too much. The dog who is frequently impaired, who makes bad decisions under the influence, whose alcoholism is part of his character architecture the same way Peter's childishness is part of his. But when you trace Brian's drinking across the seasons, something uncomfortable emerges. In the early seasons, the drinking is part of a portrait of a sophisticated but somewhat melancholy character. Brian drinks martinis. He has a refined palate. The alcohol is associated with his intellectual persona, with his literary ambitions, with the particular kind of sadness that affects sensitive people who are more perceptive than their circumstances allow them to be. In the later seasons, the drinking becomes less refined and more compulsive. Brian does stupid, genuinely harmful things while drunk. He destroys things he cares about. He hurts people he loves. He wakes up from alcoholic blackouts in situations that have caused lasting damage. The comedy of his drinking becomes darker, the consequences more severe, and the show's willingness to actually engage with the damage is inconsistent in a way that makes the darker moments hit harder. You are watching a character with a genuine problem that the show can neither ignore nor properly address. So it keeps the problem in frame as comedy, while the edges of the frame show something that is not funny at all. The Reddit theory from user Grandmaster Sexay, which circulated extensively in the fan community, proposed that Brian's intellectual and moral degradation over the seasons is a realistic depiction of what sustained alcohol and drug abuse does to a brain. The dog brain is physically smaller and more vulnerable than a human brain. The substances that Brian has consumed over the show's run have, under this theory, produced measurable and real damage to his cognitive function. He is not getting dumber because the writers gave up on him. He is getting dumber because he has been damaging his own brain for years. His selfishness, his inability to follow through on good intentions, his declining judgment, all of it is consistent with the neurological effects of long-term substance abuse. The character study that the show stumbled into, accidentally or otherwise, is a fairly accurate portrait of functional alcoholism's long game. There is one episode that towers above all others when it comes to Brian Griffin's emotional truth, and it is Season 8's Brian and Stewie. In this episode, the two of them get locked in a bank vault over a holiday weekend and are forced to spend the entire episode alone with each other. There are no cutaways. There are no other characters. There is no plot beyond two beings stuck in a room and talking. And in this episode, Brian reveals to Stewie that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box. He reveals that the gun is there for a specific purpose. He has thought about using it on himself. He has stood close enough to that edge to make a practical provision for reaching it. He has not used it, but he has prepared it. This is one of the most startling moments in the show's entire run, and it is surrounded by enough comedy and enough Stewie reaction jokes that it is easy to let it slip by without fully registering what just happened. A beloved character in the middle of a family comedy has disclosed that he has considered suicide and has placed the means to do so within reach. And the show does not flinch from it. Stewie's response is not a joke. It is genuine concern and genuine love. He tells Brian that the gun will remain in the box. He tells Brian that Brian matters. The scene is not resolved with a punchline. It is resolved with the kind of quiet, real emotional truth that the show almost never attempted and almost never achieved. What does it mean that Brian Griffin, the character most directly connected to Seth MacFarlane's own inner life, has a gun in a box? You can read this as pure storytelling, as the writers making a bold choice for a bottle episode. You can also read it as something more personal, a confession dressed as fiction, a private truth given a public shape through the medium of an animated dog. The show will not confirm or deny, and probably should not. But the moment is there and it is real, and it is the closest this show ever came to saying something completely unguarded about the inner life of its most authentic character. Section 6. Meg and the Sacrifice Theory. The Pearl at the Bottom of the Sea. We talked about Meg as a pearl in the first section, and now we are going to go much deeper into what the show did with this character, what the fan community has built around her, and why the most uncomfortable parts of the Meg Griffin storyline are, in hindsight, not just dark comedy, but something that carries genuine weight. Meg Griffin was, in the very beginning, ordinary. The first 3 seasons presented her as a teenage girl who was struggling with the usual inventory of high school anxieties. Unpopularity, the desire to fit in, the exhaustion of living with a chaotic family when all you want is to be a normal kid. She was not the center of the show, but she was not its target either. She was the realest person in the room, the one with the most plausible emotional landscape, and the show treated her with a kind of affectionate indifference that felt true to the experience of being the least dramatic member of a very dramatic family. Then something changed. The post-revival seasons discovered that mistreating Meg generated a specific audience response. People laughed. The contrast between Meg's earnest desire for acceptance and her family's casual cruelty was funny in a particular register. So the show went there more frequently, and then more frequently still. And at some point, the frequency tipped into something that was no longer quite comedy. It became systematic. It became a ritual. And rituals, by definition, mean something beyond the surface action. The sacrifice theory, which has been articulated in various forms across the fan community, proposes that Meg Griffin's role in the Griffin household is not incidental to the show's dynamics. It is structural. Specifically, the theory holds that Meg functions as a sacrificial figure, a symbolic container for the family's collective dysfunction, the person onto whom all the frustration, anger, and darkness of the household is projected and displaced. By absorbing all of the negativity, she keeps the family stable. Remove her, and the system collapses. This theory was, in a way, canonized by the show itself in the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, which we discussed in the reference transcript at the beginning of this video. In that episode, Meg finally confronts her family about their treatment of her. She lays it all out. The years of abuse, the contempt, the cruelty. And when she does, the family falls apart. Without Meg as the target, Peter turns on Lois. Lois turns on Chris. Brian turns on everyone. The social contract of the Griffin household, which depends entirely on having a designated scapegoat, disintegrates the moment the scapegoat refuses the role. And then, in the episode's most troubling moment, Meg chooses to take the role back. She tells Brian that she has realized her function in the family. She understands that she is the one who absorbs the overflow, and she accepts it, not out of weakness, but out of love. She loves her family enough to be the vessel for their worst impulses, because the alternative is watching them destroy each other. Whether the show intends this as dark comedy or as something more serious is genuinely ambiguous. The episode was clearly written with some emotional intelligence, more than the show typically applied to Meg. The writers knew at some level what they were depicting. They knew this was not a comfortable or funny situation, and yet the choice they made to have Meg consciously accept the sacrifice is morally complex in a way that the show rarely attempted. The religious resonance of this structure is impossible to miss, whether intended or not. A figure who absorbs the sins of the community, who takes on the darkness so that others can function, who is mistreated as a direct consequence of this function, and who returns to this role voluntarily, having briefly considered walking away. This is a familiar mythological shape. It shows up in cultures around the world, in religious traditions spanning millennia. The scapegoat is one of the oldest human social technologies. The Meg arc, mapped onto this template, becomes genuinely strange. There is also the question of Meg's real intelligence and capability, which the show keeps gesturing at without committing to. Meg, when given the space to be herself rather than the target, is actually quite good. She has moments of genuine emotional insight that her family lacks. She has moments of physical courage. The episodes that treat her as a full character, rather than a recipient of abuse, reveal someone with real dimensions. She plays the French horn. She is competent enough academically to get into college in some storylines. She shows more self-awareness than any other member of the family in the moments when the show allows her to have it. This creates a painful irony that the theory community has noticed. Meg is, in many ways, the most complete person in the Griffin household. The most aware, the most capable of genuine reflection. And she spends her entire existence in a situation that requires her to suppress all of that in order to be the vessel for other people's worst impulses. The most capable member of the family is the one most thoroughly ground down by it. The Meg as Stewie's biological mother theory deserves its moment here, because it is one of the most ambitious pieces of fan theorizing in the show's community, and it reframes several things about the household dynamics in ways that are genuinely interesting. The theory originated in a Reddit thread from 2016 and has been built upon extensively since. The basic claim is this: Meg became pregnant as a teenager from a relationship with a boy who left when he discovered she was pregnant. Lois, to protect Meg from shame and from Peter's potential reaction, agreed to raise the child as her own. Brian, who is in on everything, helped cover the pregnancy. Peter and Chris, both of limited intelligence, never questioned it. The evidence cited includes a moment in the banned episode Partial Terms of Endearment, where Lois casually mentions Bonnie Meg giving birth to Stewie and then treats it as a joke. Meg does not react to this comment with the outrage you would expect if it were simply a random insult. Her non-reaction reads as the reaction of someone who knows it is true and has decided to treat it as though it were not. There is also the noted fact that every flashback to Stewie's birth cuts away before the mother's face is shown. Always from Stewie's point of view, always leaving the identity of the mother ambiguous. If this theory is correct, several things about Meg and Stewie's relationship become different. Stewie's occasional and surprising tenderness toward Meg, the moments when he defends her or shows genuine affection, would be the instinctive pull of a child toward his biological mother, operating below the level of his conscious knowledge. Meg's particular anguish about her place in the family would have an additional dimension. She is not just the abused daughter. She is the girl who gave up her child and watches him be raised by her mother, unable to say anything, loving him in secret from across a room. And the fact that Brian helped cover this up would explain the particular quality of his relationship with Meg. He is not cruel to her the way the others are. He is, when the show allows it, somewhat protective of her. Because he knows. He is the only one besides Lois and Meg who knows. And the weight of that knowledge is carried in every slightly too careful interaction Brian has with the eldest Griffin child. There is also the darker reading of this theory, which notes that if Meg is Stewie's mother, then the abuse the Griffin family directs at Meg is not just cruelty toward a daughter. It is cruelty toward the biological mother of the youngest member of the household, perpetrated in front of the child in the child's formative years. What does Stewie absorb from watching his mother be humiliated and hurt every day, not knowing she is his mother? What does it do to a child's psychological formation to grow up watching a person? They will later learn they came from being treated as something less than fully human? The early Stewie's desire to kill Lois under this reading becomes something different. He does not want to kill his mother. He does not know who his mother is. He wants to destroy the woman who is performing motherhood, the woman who is in the mother's role, because something in him recognizes that the performance is a lie and cannot articulate why. The rage is displaced. The target is wrong. And when Stewie eventually becomes softer, when the murderous impulse fades, it is because the bonds of affection for the household he actually grew up in have won out over the displaced rage he cannot trace to its source. Meg deserves better than the show gave her for most of its run. This is not a controversial opinion. Even the people who made the show eventually acknowledged it, and the later seasons made real attempts to address it. But the damage was done across those middle seasons, and what the theorizing community has done with that damage is remarkable. They took a character who was designed to be a punching bag and, by thinking carefully about why she existed in that role, turned her into the most mythologically significant figure in the show. The Pearl, the scapegoat, the secret mother, the most human person in a family of cartoons. Section 7. The Chicken Fight Conspiracy. What Peter and Ernie are actually fighting about. On the surface, the Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant chicken fights are exactly what they look like. A fat man and a giant bird engaged in an enormously destructive, elaborately choreographed battle that starts every time over something trivial and ends with an inconclusive victory for Peter, followed by Ernie surviving to fight another day. These fights are among the most beloved set pieces in the show's history. They are parodying action movie conventions. They are enjoying the absurdity of their own premise. They are funny. But the fan community, bless them, has spent an extraordinary amount of time asking a question that the show itself has never fully answered. What is the feud really about? And the answer, when you start to assemble the pieces, is that the chicken fights are about something much more specific and much more human than they appear. The canonical origin of the feud, as established in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, is that Ernie gave Peter an expired coupon. Peter tried to use the coupon at a store. The coupon was no good. The cashier presumably refused to honor it, and Peter was angry and directed that anger at Ernie, who had given him the coupon, and a fight broke out, and the fight has been recurring ever since. An expired coupon. 25 years of intermittent catastrophic violence. Hundreds of civilians presumably killed or injured in the collateral damage. Billions of dollars in property destruction across a fictional Rhode Island town, all of it traceable to the moment a man could not redeem a piece of paper for a discount. When you say it plainly like that, it is funny. It is clearly designed to be funny. The disproportionality between the cause and the effect is the joke. But there is also something deeply recognizable in it, and that recognition is where the fan theories about the chicken fights become genuinely interesting. The expired coupon is not just an expired coupon. In the world of Peter Griffin, a man of limited financial means who is deeply susceptible to feeling cheated or disrespected, an expired coupon represents something larger. It represents being told that something you believed you had earned, something that was promised to you, is no longer valid. The coupon was his. He received it. It was a promise. And then the promise was broken, and he was told by the person who gave it to him that he would get nothing. That is not just an inconvenience. To a man who is already operating at the edge of dignity, who is already carrying the accumulated slights of a lifetime of being underestimated, that is an indignity. And dignities, once violated, are not easily repaired. There is a theory that the chicken fights represent Peter's relationship with the concept of male pride and wounded dignity. Ernie appears at moments when Peter's sense of himself as a capable, respected man is most vulnerable. Not always. The fights are triggered by different incidents, but consistently across the sequence of fights, Peter is at a moment of insecurity or frustration when Ernie arrives. The chicken is the externalization of the thing that has just insulted Peter's pride, and the fight is the fantasy of resolving that insult through force. Notice also that Peter always wins. Always. No matter how devastating the fight, no matter how clearly Peter seems to be finished, no matter how many times Ernie apparently has the upper hand, Peter wins. The final blow is always Peter's, and Ernie, in the classic structure, rises again after Peter has left, confirming that the fight is not resolved, that the next encounter will come. But in the immediate aftermath, Peter is victorious. He has defended his dignity. He has won. The fan theory goes further by suggesting that Ernie the giant chicken represents a specific relationship in Peter's life, rather than a general concept. Some theorists have proposed that Ernie represents Peter's stepfather, Francis. The expired coupon, which is what started everything, represents the broken promise of fatherly approval that Francis could never deliver. The recurring nature of the fights represents the recurring nature of the unresolved wound. Peter keeps coming back to fight the chicken because the underlying issue was never resolved. Francis died before Peter fully processed what their relationship was. The fights are Peter's psyche's way of continuing a confrontation that reality ended prematurely. Under this reading, the fact that Peter always wins takes on a different emotional quality. He never won with Francis. Francis died while still withholding his approval, still calling Peter a fat, stinking drunk with his final breath. In the dream world of the show, Peter gets to win. He gets to defeat the source of the indignity. He gets to stand over it. And it never fully dies, which means he gets to win again. And again. The fantasy of resolution keeps repeating, because the real wound never closed. There is also the matter of the fight choreography itself, which is worth dwelling on because it is genuinely remarkable. The chicken fights are among the most technically ambitious sequences the show produces. The animation is more detailed, more fluid, more cinematically composed than anything else in the show. The fights reference action movie conventions from the 1980s and 90s, the era of Peter's formative cultural consumption. They move through environments with a kind of visual logic and energy that the show's regular animation does not attempt. What this means is that the show pours its maximum technical effort into these fights. They are the place where the animation team demonstrates what it can do. They are, in a production sense, the show's most serious work. And they are deployed in service of the most ridiculous premise. The contrast between the artistic ambition of the fights and the absurdity of their cause is itself a kind of argument. The most beautifully made thing in the show is about an expired coupon. This could be read as a joke about Hollywood action movies, which deploy spectacular filmmaking in service of stories that are essentially about male pride. Two men in a fight, and the fight is extraordinary in its execution and trivial in its cause. That is most action movies. The chicken fight is a compressed and a naked version of a very expensive genre. Ernie, it should be noted, has a family. He has a wife named Nicole and children. He is not simply an avatar of evil or a manifestation of Peter's unresolved issues. He is a being with his own life, his own relationships, his own reasons for being angry about whatever specific incident triggers each new fight. The show occasionally humanizes him in these ways, showing him in domestic contexts, showing that whatever the feud means symbolically to Peter, Ernie experiences it as a real ongoing conflict with a specific man who keeps fighting him. He has a grievance too. He is always somehow injured and always somehow survives to carry it into the next encounter. He is, in his own way, as indestructible as Peter. They are perfectly matched. Two beings who cannot resolve their conflict and cannot die from it. There are fan theories that propose the chicken fights are actually occurring in a different plane of reality from the show's main narrative, which is a wild leap, but not entirely without support. The fights consistently produce damage that would logically be visible in subsequent episodes. Environmental damage, building destruction, widespread civilian casualties, and yet the world is always returned to normal afterward. The toll of the fights does not persist in the way that the show's other events sometimes do. They exist, as one theorist phrased it, in a narrative parenthesis. They open, they happen, they close, and the world that emerges from the other side is the same world that existed before, which is, again, consistent with a dream logic where events can be maximally intense and then completely without trace. The fate of Ernie is worth addressing here. As of 2025, the show's producers confirmed in an interview that Ernie the Giant Chicken is dead. The character had been killed in an episode with finality, no gasping return this time, and the producers confirmed that the chicken fights had concluded. They cited the difficulty of topping previous fights and the extraordinary production demand they placed on the animation team. The era of the chicken fights is over. This is notable because it means the show has, for the first time, closed the loop on Peter's most symbolic recurring conflict. Whatever the chicken fights meant, they are finished. Whatever wound they were circling, it has been allowed to stop bleeding. Whether that is narrative growth or simply practical production decision is, like so much in this show, left ambiguous. Section 8. Death, God, and the Afterlife. The theology of a very strange universe. Most animated comedies handle death as a punchline. A character dies, the audience laughs. The character is back next episode with no explanation required. Death in this genre is not meant to be taken seriously. It is a comedic beat. It resets itself automatically. Family Guy does something different. It takes death seriously and comedically at the same time, and the way it does this reveals something genuinely interesting about the metaphysical structure of the show's universe. Because Family Guy does not treat death as a reset button. It treats death as a state that is real but navigable, subject to negotiation, capable of being reversed under specific circumstances, governed by rules that are flexible but not entirely absent. It has a theology, a strange one, a frequently contradictory one, but one that has been constructed with enough consistency to be worth examining. Death is a character in this show, not a concept. A character, a physical being who shows up in a black hooded robe, carries the traditional implements, and is responsible for collecting souls when their time comes. He first appears in the season 2 episode Death is a Bitch, voiced by Norm Macdonald, which was a casting choice so perfect that the show has never fully recovered from the necessity of recasting the role after Macdonald's death in 2021. Adam Carolla took over the voice for subsequent appearances, and is fine. But Macdonald's death had a specific quality, this weary, put-upon professionalism, mixed with an almost adolescent insecurity about his social standing, that made the character genuinely memorable. What makes the show's death figure philosophically interesting is not his appearance or his function, which are conventional, but his personality. He is tired of being the bad guy. He keeps making this point. He knows that everyone hates him, that he is a symbol of loss and grief and the end of everything, and he finds this deeply unfair because he is just doing a job. He did not choose to be Death. He is simply the being responsible for a necessary function in the universe's operation, and he is exhausted by the contempt that function generates. He is, in his own words, lonely. This humanization of death serves a specific theological function. It suggests that the universe of this show does not operate on moral judgment in the conventional sense. Death does not come for the wicked and spare the virtuous. He comes based on a schedule, on timing, on the architecture of fate. He sprained his ankle once while chasing Peter, and while he recovered at the Griffin house, anyone who died during that period could not be collected and simply kept living. Death's incapacity created a temporary suspension of mortality that was handled as a comedy plot, but that implies something very specific about the show's cosmology. Death is a physical being with physical limitations. When those limitations are in play, death itself is in play. Mortality is not a cosmic absolute in this universe. It is a logistical function. The God character in this show is equally revealing. God appears periodically, usually voiced in a way that makes him sound like a somewhat harried, middle-aged man who has too many responsibilities and not quite enough time to handle all of them well. He is, within the show's mythology, the supreme being. He created the universe, specifically in one version of events, by lighting a fart on fire during an arm wrestling match with his college roommate. The universe that contains the Griffins, the town, all of it, was created as a byproduct of flatulence during a moment of physical competition. This is either the most disrespectful creation myth ever produced for a broadcast television audience, or it is the most honest one. Because here is the thing. If you live in a world where the supreme being created existence accidentally as a side effect of something else he was doing, then the rules of that existence carry the texture of the accident that created them. They are not planned. They are not designed with purpose. They are the physical consequences of a random event, shaped by no particular intention, producing no particular meaning. The Griffin family lives in an accidental universe. Their suffering is not meaningful in a cosmic sense. Their joy is not being supervised or rewarded. They are simply here in the aftermath of a very old fart, doing what they can. This theology maps onto the show's emotional register with uncomfortable accuracy. The Griffins are not being tested. They are not growing towards something. They are not part of a plan. They are just living in the consequences of circumstances they did not choose. In a universe that was not designed to accommodate them specifically, under the loose governance of a God who is trying his best, but is frequently distracted by more pressing matters, like finding a date or dealing with a crisis in another part of the world while watching TV. God's relationship with the specific inhabitants of the town is notably personal in the show's mythology. He has opinions about the New England Patriots. He occasionally intervenes in individual lives for reasons that are more personal than principled. He nearly grants Meg's wish to die in one episode, which would have been a devastating act of divine mercy if it had gone through. He watches Family Guy on his smartphone while managing his other divine responsibilities, which creates the brain-bending implication that the show we are watching is also a show being watched by the God of the show we are watching. This is, in philosophy, the Droste effect, the recursive image, the painting within the painting, the God who watches the show about his own creation. And it raises a question that the show would never answer directly, but that the fan community has explored at length. If God watches Family Guy, and Family Guy is a show about the people who live in the world God created, then God is watching a show about himself. Every decision he makes in the show is, from his perspective, an event in the story he is consuming. The creator and the creation watch each other. Neither is entirely the author. Neither is entirely the audience. Heaven in this show is depicted as a kind of resort. The episode where Peter and his friends get death to take them to heaven to confront God about the Patriots' losing record describes heaven as being like a sandals resort, a tropical paradise of comfortable leisure managed by a divine proprietor who is somewhat harried and somewhat defensive about the way things are run. Hell is referenced occasionally. John Hughes, in a brief afterlife appearance, confirms that getting into heaven requires being genuinely good, not just nominally religious. The criteria are demanding. Most people apparently end up somewhere else. What is interesting about the show's afterlife geography is the question of what happens to characters who die and then undie. Brian died and came back. Various characters have died in episodes and returned without explanation. The show's relationship with death is, as we have established, logistical rather than absolute. But what happened to Brian during the brief period between his death and his resurrection? Where was he? The show does not address this. There is no Brian in the afterlife episode during his brief death. He is simply gone and then back. But there is a fan theory that proposes the 2 episodes after Brian's death, during which the family adjusts to Vinny and attempts to move forward, are actually occurring in 2 different time streams simultaneously. In one stream, Brian is dead and Vinny is the dog. In the other stream, Stewie has already gone back in time and pulled Brian from the street, but the effects of this intervention are propagating forward through time. The overlap between the timelines creates a strange membrane where both realities are technically valid, which is why some of the post-death episodes feel slightly off, slightly different in tone, slightly wrong in ways that are hard to pinpoint. The timeline has been disrupted. The characters are living in the seam between the original history and the revised one. Vinny exists in this seam as a kind of ghost, a figure from the timeline that was erased, hovering at the edge of a reality that has moved on without him. This is probably too elaborate for what was actually a rating stunt, but it is a beautiful theory, and it fits the show's mechanics. The show's theology also addresses resurrection in a broader sense through Stewie's time machine. Every significant death or loss that the main characters have suffered has a potential technical remedy available within the show's established physics. Stewie could go back. He has done it. He has saved Brian with this technology. The implication is that every death in the show's universe is, in theory, reversible, if someone who has access to the time machine and the knowledge of when the death occurred chose to act on it. The God as safety net that traditional theology provides is replaced in this universe by the genius baby as safety net. Stewie is the show's actual supreme being. He has more reliable access to temporal manipulation than God has to divine intervention. He is the one who can actually undo things. He is the one who actually does undo them. This is a strange kind of religious statement. The traditional God of this universe is absent-minded, occasionally helpful, not reliably available. The actual godlike figure, the one with real power over life and death, is a 1-year-old in a diaper who builds his own machines. Section 9. The 4 friends and what they really represent. Let us turn our attention from the Griffin household itself to the 4 men who populate Peter's social world, because the composition of this friend group is, when examined carefully, one of the most deliberately constructed elements of the show's universe. Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire are not just a collection of funny character types thrown together for comic contrast. They are a specific quartet, an ensemble that embodies something. And what they embody, once you see it, explains a great deal about why the group works, and why the specific degradation of their relationships in later seasons felt so much like a loss. In classical literature and mythology, there is a recurring structure in which a central figure is accompanied by 3 companions who embody different aspects of a complete personality or different aspects of a moral landscape. The knight and his retinue, the hero and his advisors, the fool and his court. The central figure is defined by the tension and interaction between these companions. Each represents something the central figure has in some form but cannot contain alone. Peter Griffin is, in this reading, the central figure, and his 3 companions represent 3 specific human qualities. Joe Swanson is duty. He is a police officer. He is a disabled man who continues to perform at the highest level of his profession, despite the physical challenges his condition creates. In the early seasons, Joe is the character who takes things seriously, who follows through, who has commitments and honors them. He is the man with a job that has real consequences, where things actually matter, where the choices made affect real people. He is, in the group, the conscience, the one who reminds the others by his presence that the world has stakes. Cleveland Brown is patience and goodness. In the early seasons, Cleveland is the warmest member of the group, the one most likely to listen, most likely to offer genuine comfort, most likely to respond to crisis with emotional intelligence rather than instinct. He is not passive, but he is measured in a way the others are not. He absorbs tension rather than generating it. He is, in the group, the emotional regulator, the one who keeps the temperature from getting too high. Quagmire is appetite, unchecked, unapologetic, often outrageous appetite. He is the man who pursues pleasure without restraint, who is defined by his desires rather than by his principles. He is funny because his lack of restraint is extreme enough to become absurd. He is also, in the group, the most honest in a perverse way. He does not pretend to be other than he is. He does not hold himself to standards he has no intention of meeting. There is a dark purity to Quagmire's self-understanding. He knows what he is. He has simply decided not to fight it. Peter stands at the center of this triangle. He has Joe's capacity for loyalty without Joe's capacity for consistent responsibility. He has Cleveland's warmth without Cleveland's emotional intelligence. He has Quagmire's appetite without Quagmire's self-awareness. He is, in the terms of this framework, the incomplete person surrounded by the qualities he partially possesses but cannot fully integrate. The group, as a whole, is a complete person. Peter alone is the fractured center. This framework illuminates why the deterioration of these relationships in later seasons is not just comedy getting darker. It is a philosophical dismantlement. When Joe becomes a figure of contempt and mockery rather than respect, the group loses its conscience. When Cleveland leaves to anchor his own spin-off show, the group loses its emotional regulator. When Quagmire becomes Peter's antagonist rather than his complement, the appetite function in the group turns hostile, turned against itself. The four-part whole that the group represented in the early season's fragments. And what is left is Peter without the qualities he needed from his companions to be anything better than his worst self. The Drunken Clam, where the group gathers, has been touched on briefly but deserves more attention here. Bars in fiction serve specific narrative functions. They are liminal spaces, spaces between home and work, between identity and anonymity, where people can be simultaneously themselves and not themselves. The rituals of the bar, the ordering, the drinking, the conversation, the particular kind of honesty that alcohol and the informal setting produce, are ways of accessing truths that the formal world does not allow. The Drunken Clam is where these four men are most themselves. It is where they say the things they cannot say at home or at work. It is where the friendship actually lives. And the name, which we touched on earlier, matters again here. The clam opens when drunk. These men open when they are here, in this place, with these people, with the lubricant of alcohol and companionship. Outside they are closed, they are performing, they are husbands and fathers and cops and neighbors. Here they are, for a few hours, something more elemental. Something closer to the actual men underneath all the roles. The tragedy of the later seasons, where the Drunken Clam conversations become more hostile, where the friends become more openly awful to each other, where the warmth that used to fill the bar is replaced by something colder and more corrosive, is the tragedy of watching a sacred space lose its sanctity. Not through any dramatic event, but through the gradual accumulation of choices that each member of the group made, choices that made them worse and meaner and less capable of the kind of genuine openness that the early bar scenes represented. Joe's arc deserves specific attention because it traces the most complete degradation from respect to contempt. In the very first episode he appears in, a first-season installment called A Hero Sits Next Door, Joe moves in next door to the Griffins and becomes immediately popular with everyone on the street. He is athletic despite his paralysis, brave, accomplished, admirable in every conventional sense. Peter's initial reaction to Joe is jealousy. He wants what Joe has, the respect, the admiration, the way people light up when Joe enters the room. Over the seasons, this relationship inverts completely. Joe, who was once the person everyone envied, becomes a figure that is openly mocked, whose disability is used as a punchline, whose wife eventually loses interest in him, whose closest friends treat him with casual contempt rather than the admiration that characterized their early relationship. The character's arc, from respected to diminished, mirrors the arc of the show itself. In the early seasons, the show was Joe. Everyone wanted to be watching it. In the later seasons, the show became something that people endured rather than celebrated. and the man who was once the most admirable presence in the neighborhood became, somehow, the butt of the joke. Cleveland's departure for his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, in 2009 was handled within the Family Guy universe as Cleveland, simply moving away, leaving for a new life. His house across the street from the Griffins was given over to the Quagmire family in some episodes, and then the house became a background detail without consistent occupancy. Cleveland himself returned to Family Guy after his spin-off was canceled in 2013, resuming his place in the friend group. But his absence was felt, and not just because the quartet was briefly reduced to a trio. His absence was felt because the emotional quality he brought to the group, the warmth and patience we identified earlier, was absent from the show's interpersonal texture during those years. The friend group without Cleveland was a body without one of its organs, functional but not fully healthy, missing something it could not quite name. There is a fan theory about Cleveland that proposes his spin-off was not just a network decision, but a narrative inevitability. Cleveland Brown is the most emotionally healthy member of the group. He is the one who, in any realistic assessment, would have the best life outcomes. He would recognize the toxicity of his social environment before the others would. He would be most likely to leave, to build something better for himself, to escape the gravity of the town. The spin-off was the show's way of acknowledging this, of allowing Cleveland to have a life that the constraints of the Griffin family's orbit would never have permitted. His return, when the Cleveland show ended, was a return to a place that had changed in his absence, a place that was darker and less warm than the one he left. And his reintegration into the friend group was always slightly uncomfortable, slightly off, as though Cleveland was walking back into a house where things had been rearranged while he was gone. The Quagmire and Brian feud, which consumed significant amounts of the show's later seasons, is also worth examining through this friendship lens. Quagmire hates Brian. He is vocal about it. He has delivered one of the show's most famous speeches detailing exactly why he hates Brian, listing every hypocrisy and failure and piece of selfish behavior in specific, accurate detail. The speech is correct. Everything Quagmire says about Brian in that speech is demonstrably true. The fan community has asked why Quagmire hates Brian so specifically and so intensely. The surface answer is that Brian hit on Quagmire's father after the revelation that Quagmire's father is a trans woman, which was, in the show's treatment, a source of deep discomfort for Quagmire. But the deeper answer, the one that has more thematic weight, is that Quagmire and Brian are in direct competition for the same identity. They are both men defined primarily by desire and appetite and the pursuit of gratification. Quagmire does not pretend to be anything else. Brian pretends to be an intellectual and a moral person while behaving in ways that are indistinguishable from Quagmire's behavior at its worst. Quagmire hates Brian because Brian is doing what Quagmire does, but claiming a moral high ground that the behavior does not support. He is a hypocrite. And to the one person in the group who at least has the integrity to own his appetite without pretense, the hypocrisy is intolerable. This makes the Quagmire-Brian feud not a simple character conflict, but a philosophical debate. Honesty about what you are, even if what you are is not admirable, versus dishonesty about what you are, which allows you to perform virtue while practicing the same thing. Quagmire weirdly wins this debate. His self-knowledge, however it is applied, is more genuine than Brian's self-presentation. Section 10. Time, memory, and the continuity breaks. What the errors might actually mean. Let us talk about the show's relationship with its own past, because this is one of the most fascinating and most underexplored areas of Family Guy analysis, and it is where some of the most structurally interesting theories live. Family Guy has continuity problems. This is not a secret. The show's writers and producers have acknowledged them. The fan community catalogs them with a thoroughness that verges on archival obsession. Character histories change between episodes. Biographical details contradict each other. Events that should have consequences do not, while inconsequential things are occasionally treated with narrative permanence. The ages of the children shift. The backstories of adult characters revise themselves. Relationships that should be strained by what happened last week are completely normal the following week. The standard explanation for all of this is straightforward. It is a long-running animated comedy. Continuity is difficult to maintain across hundreds of episodes written by rotating teams of writers over decades. The mistakes are real, but they are mistakes, products of limited attention and limited resources, and the basic impossibility of keeping perfect track of a complex fictional world across a very long run. This explanation is almost certainly correct in most cases, but there is a more interesting possibility for some of the continuity breaks, one that elevates the errors from failure into something deliberate. What if some of these inconsistencies are not mistakes? What if they are the show's way of telling us something about the nature of the world the Griffins inhabit? Consider the address discrepancy. 31 Spooner Street is the canonical address, but in an early episode, the address briefly appears as 72 Spooner Street. This has been cataloged as a continuity error, a simple production mistake where a prop was made incorrectly. But what if the two addresses represent two different states of the same location? Not two mistakes, but two versions. The house at 31 is the house we know. The house at 72 is the same house in a slightly different configuration of the world it inhabits. The number changed because something changed. The change is imperceptible in everything else, but left a trace in the address. It is the kind of difference that would appear in two parallel timelines that are almost but not quite identical. This is a wild reading, and it is almost certainly not what any writer intended. But once you start applying it, it produces a peculiar coherence. The show's continuity errors, under this framework, are not failures of craft. They are evidence of temporal instability. The town exists in a universe where Stewie's time machine has been used multiple times, where parallel universes have been accessed, where the timeline has been revised and re-revised. Of course, things do not quite match up. The timeline has been tampered with. The version of events we are watching is not the original version. It is a revised version, and the seams show. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10 is the show's most explicit engagement with its own timeline instability. In this episode, Brian and Stewie use the time machine to travel back to the events of the pilot episode, the first episode of the show that aired in 1999. They interact with the past versions of themselves in a plot involving national security and alternate histories. And what they observe when they are in the past is the show itself in its original form. They see the slightly different animation. They notice the way things looked before certain revisions. They are, in a literal narrative sense, watching the earlier version of their own reality. The implication of this episode, which the show plays for laughs and metafictional jokes, but which carries a genuinely strange implication, is that the current version of Family Guy that we watch is not the original version. It is a subsequent version, one that emerged from the temporal interventions that Brian and Stewie undertook in that episode. Everything that has happened since the pilot has happened in a timeline that was already revised at least once. The show we have been watching for decades is the show that resulted from a time travel intervention. We have never seen the original Family Guy. We have only ever seen the revision. This framework also provides an interesting way to think about why certain things change dramatically between seasons in ways that feel discontinuous. Characters who were different in the early seasons and then became different later were not simply changed by the writers. They were changed by the timeline. Something happened, some temporal event, some interference with the original flow of events, that produced the versions of these characters that we see in the middle and later seasons. Early Peter and late Peter are not the same character arc. They are the same person in two different timelines that diverged at some undisclosed point. Meg's biological situation provides one of the most interesting continuity-related mysteries. There is an episode that establishes, in what appears to be canonical terms, that Meg's biological father is not Peter Griffin. A character named Stan Thompson is identified as Meg's biological father in the Season 3 episode. Screwed the Pooch, in a scene that appears to treat this as factual. Peter does not react with the disbelief you would expect. The revelation does not generate lasting consequences. It is introduced and then quietly allowed to fade. Subsequent seasons treat Meg as Peter's biological daughter, without any apparent awareness that this was ever in question. Under the standard reading, this is a continuity error. The show introduced something and forgot it. But under the timeline theory, it is something else. Meg's biological parentage was revised at some point in the timeline. The original timeline had Stan Thompson as her father. The revised timeline has Peter. The episode that mentions Stan Thompson is a residue of the original timeline, a brief moment where the truth of the previous version bleeds through. The show's apparent forgetfulness is actually the seam showing. The most ambitious and most unsettling continuity theory holds that the entire show has been revised multiple times, each revision producing a slightly different version of the characters and their history, and that all of these versions are simultaneously accessible in the show's archive. This is why different episodes feel like they belong to different shows. Because they do. Each season contains some episodes from the revised timeline and some from the original or from intermediate revisions. And the lack of coherent continuity is the inevitable result of time having been non-linearly edited in a universe that does not have the accounting infrastructure to manage it. The aging mystery is perhaps the most fundamental continuity issue the show faces. The children began the show at specific ages. Meg at 15 or 16, Chris at 13, Stewie at 1. As of the show's 25th year, they are still approximately these ages, despite the show having depicted roughly 25 years of real-world time passing, with references to contemporary culture and events suggesting the story is always occurring in the present. By any arithmetic, Meg should be in her 40s. Chris should be in his late 30s. Stewie should be in his mid-20s. One theory, which takes the idea of Stewie's unique power to its furthest conclusion, proposes that Stewie is deliberately preventing the aging of the family. Not consciously, not as part of a scheme, but as a passive consequence of his manipulation of the timeline. Every time Stewie has intervened in the show's history to prevent a death or undo an event, he has also, as a side effect, frozen the timeline at a particular moment of personal significance to him. He does not want to grow up. He has the technology to prevent it. The entire family's suspension in time is the result of the most powerful being in the household having used his abilities, whether consciously or not, to keep himself in the only moment he feels safe in. This is poignant in a way that takes the theory from conspiracy to something more like mythology. Stewie Griffin, who is the most dangerous being in the show's original premise, whose ambition extended to world domination, has used all of his extraordinary capability to do one thing: to keep his family in place, to freeze the moment before they grow up and change and become people he does not recognize, to hold the household at the exact temperature and configuration that he, somewhere in his extraordinary mind, has determined is home. The monster became the keeper, the destroyer became the preserver, and everyone else in the family moves through life unaware that the baby in the corner is the reason they are all still here exactly as they were, in the late afternoon light of a day that never quite becomes evening. Section 11. Seth MacFarlane's Hidden Messages, The Real Man in the Machine. Seth MacFarlane was born in Kent, Connecticut in 1973. He graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1995. He spent a few years working in animation before pitching Family Guy. He created a universe that has now been running for more than a quarter century, and he did most of the foundational work before he was 25 years old. What the show carries inside it, whether as intention or as the unavoidable print of its creator's perspective and personality and preoccupations, is a worldview. Not a simple one, not a consistent one. A worldview that contains contradictions, blind spots, genuine insights, and occasional moments of extraordinary clarity about what it means to be alive in a specific era in a specific country. And when you look for the moments where that worldview surfaces most clearly, when you look for the places where the comedy peels back and you can see what the man who made it actually believed and feared and valued, you find some genuinely surprising things. The 9/11 near miss is the most significant real-world event in MacFarlane's biography, and it is one of the most extraordinary stories of accidental survival in recent cultural history. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. He had been in Rhode Island the night before, giving a lecture at his alma mater. He went out with friends afterward. He had too much to drink. He overslept the next morning. His travel agent had given him the wrong departure time, telling him the flight left at 8:15 in the morning when the actual departure was 7:45. MacFarlane arrived at the gate approximately 10 minutes after it closed. They turned him away. He went to the airport lounge and fell asleep. He woke up to commotion. Flight 11 had struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Everyone on board was killed. MacFarlane has talked about this publicly and has been remarkably measured in how he discusses it. He has said that there are probably 100 near misses in every person's life that they simply do not know about. He has noted that the significance of surviving this particular one, given its historical magnitude, is something he is not sure he has fully processed. He has described it as surreal, which is the honest word for it. What the fan community has noted, with increasing specificity over the years, is that Family Guy began embedding references to 9/11 and its themes within its content after the attacks in ways that are difficult to attribute entirely to standard topical comedy. The show had, before 9/11, already produced a joke in its first season that depicted Stewie with a bomb on an airplane and included specific dialogue about the airport and the plane. This episode aired in 2000 and was pulled from rebroadcast after the attacks. The fact that the show had a year before 9/11 made exactly this kind of joke about exactly the kind of attack that would occur, and that the show's creator was almost a victim of that attack, created a peculiar feedback loop of real and fictional that the show has been navigating ever since. MacFarlane's later episodes, particularly the season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, engaged with 9/11 directly in a way that was controversial. Brian and Stewie, traveling back to the 1999 pilot, debate whether they should warn people about the attacks. Brian argues forcefully that preventing 9/11 should be the priority. Stewie argues against intervention. The alternate timeline consequences are explored. The episode is, in retrospect, one of the most direct engagements with temporal guilt in a show that often uses time travel as a comedy device. MacFarlane was not just making a topical joke. He was, through the medium of animation and fan-beloved characters, working through the specific and unresolvable experience of being the person who almost died and did not. The question of how a person processes the knowledge that they survived something that killed 92 others on their specific flight, that a combination of a hangover and a scheduling error produced a life that would otherwise have ended at 27, is not a question that has a conventional answer. And MacFarlane, who processes things through the medium of comedy and animation, processed it in ways that are embedded in the show. He continued to make for more than 2 decades after the morning in question. The show's consistent engagement with mortality and resurrection, its treatment of death as something negotiable and reversible, its obsession with what would happen if you could go back, all of these thematic preoccupations carry the specific weight of a man who knows, more vividly than most people ever will, what it feels like to have survived something that should have been unsurvivable. The show's political commentary has been discussed extensively, but what is less discussed is the specific content of what MacFarlane was trying to say. He is, by his own account and by all external evidence, a committed secular humanist. He is skeptical of organized religion while expressing genuine fascination with spirituality and cosmology. He worked as a producer on the revival of Carl Sagan's Cosmos series and clearly holds scientific literacy as a genuine value. He is liberal in his political orientation. He cares about environmental conservation specifically in a practical sense, through organizations like Rainforest Trust. He is anti-authoritarian in a way that makes his long association with Fox, a network whose news division represents the opposite of his political values, one of the most uncomfortable professional relationships in modern broadcasting. These values surface in Family Guy in specific ways. The show's treatment of religion is complex. God is depicted as a somewhat incompetent being who created the universe accidentally. The Catholic Church is a recurring target. Religious authority figures are consistently depicted as hypocrites or failures. But the show also consistently depicts genuine faith in individual characters with something approaching respect. Francis Griffin, Peter's stepfather, is a devout Catholic who is depicted as stern and difficult, but also as someone whose faith is real, whose values are sincere even when they produce harmful behavior. The show mocks religious institutions, while often leaving intact the idea that religious feeling, the private, genuine experience of spirituality, is something deserving of some measure of respect. The environmental theme surfaces in the show more quietly than the political or religious themes, but with surprising consistency. There are episodes that engage with pollution, climate change, and corporate environmental destruction. These are not always handled with subtlety, but they are present. And they connect to something MacFarlane has been vocal about outside the show. The world that contains the Griffin family is a damaged world. The town exists in a corner of New England whose industrial history has left marks. The ocean that borders the town is the same ocean that climate change is warming and acidifying. The show's occasional engagement with these themes is MacFarlane leaving his fingerprints on the material in the places he cares most about. There is also the matter of MacFarlane's complicated relationship with Fox as a network, which we touched on in the opening framework, but which is worth exploring as a hidden message in the show itself. The show contains a remarkable number of jokes at Fox's expense. Fox News is a regular target. The network's executives are depicted unfavorably on several occasions. The show breaks the fourth wall to mock its own network with a frequency that would be remarkable for any show, but is particularly striking for a show that has been in a productive relationship with that network for its entire run. What this represents, when you read it as autobiographical rather than simply as comedy, is a man using his art to express a frustration that his professional situation does not allow him to express directly. MacFarlane has gone on record publicly about his discomfort with Fox's broader media presence. He has called his relationship with the network something like a failing marriage. The jokes in the show are the private conversations that the professional relationship does not permit. He cannot leave. He has tried. The show is a contract. But he can, within the contract, embed his actual feelings in the product he is required to produce. This is not unique to MacFarlane. Artists embedded in commercial relationships have always found ways to leave honest marks on work that the commercial relationship would prefer to be entirely compliant. MacFarlane's specific form of this is the anti-Fox joke Inside a Fox Show, the liberal political commentary on the network that has become the primary media home of American conservatism. It is a very particular kind of embedded contradiction, and it is one of the most honest things about the show. MacFarlane has spoken about the show's longevity in terms that are striking in their candor. By 2024, he was describing the show's continuation as something that had achieved what he called escape velocity, a state where there is no logical reason to stop because the audience is still there and the show is still generating revenue for causes he cares about. He was not talking about creative passion. He was not talking about stories he needed to tell. He was talking about a machine that continues to function and whose outputs fund things he values. The show, for MacFarlane in the middle and later years, is a means. It is the financial engine that powers the things he actually cares about. And yet, he shows up. Every episode, he goes into the recording booth and voices Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire. He performs these characters who were once extensions of himself and are now, after decades, something more like old acquaintances. He gives them his voice. And in the giving of voice, some trace of the original investment must remain. The machine requires the man still comes. The transaction between creator and creation continues, even after the original passion has been replaced by something more complicated and more honest. That continuity, that showing up despite everything, might be the most Peter Griffin thing about Seth MacFarlane. Section 12. The Deepest Rabbit Hole. What is Family Guy really about? We have been in this rabbit hole for a long time now. The room is quiet around you. Your breathing has probably slowed considerably from where it was when we started. The details we have covered, the names and the geography and the hidden theories and the biographical connections, have accumulated into something that is starting to feel like a shape. Not a complete shape, not a finished argument, but a shape. So let us go to the deepest level. Let us ask the question that fan theory communities always work their way toward eventually, whether they know it or not. What is this show really about? Not what it is on the surface, not the jokes, not the characters or the plots, not the cutaways or the pop culture references. What does it mean? What is the actual deepest argument that this show makes about being alive, about family, about time, about love and failure, and the persistence of people who keep showing up even when they probably should not? Let me offer a grand unified theory, and I want to be honest that this is my reading of a text that resists definitive readings. It is one coherent interpretation among many that the show's richness allows. Here it is. Family Guy is about the impossibility of change and the miracle of continuation. Let me unpack that. The Griffin family is, across 25 years of episodes, fundamentally unchanged. The reset button exists. The characters return to their baseline configurations. Growth is shown and then undone. Consequences are established and then dissolved. The show has been criticized for this pattern for most of its run, and the criticism is valid in purely craft terms. But there is another way to understand it. What if the inability to change is not a failure of the show, but its deepest truth? What if the Griffins are not failing to grow and develop in the way that good characters are supposed to? What if they are instead exactly what human beings actually are? Mostly unchanging, mostly stable in their essential configurations, returning after every disruption to the same fears and hopes and failures and loves, the same people no matter how many lessons they nominally learn? The academic critique of the show would say that characters should grow, that a narrative without development is a failed narrative. But the experiential truth of most human lives is that we are remarkably consistent. We have the same fights with the same people in the same ways for decades. We make the same resolutions. We love the same people poorly in the same ways. We mean well with the same frequency and fall short with the same predictability. The Griffins are not failing to be good characters. They are succeeding at being accurate humans. Peter Griffin is still the same man in Season 22 that he was in Season 1, because most human beings at middle age are still, at their core, the same people they were when they were younger. More weathered, more extreme in some ways, softer in others, but recognizable. You can see the young man in the middle-aged man if you look. Peter's trajectory is not character development. It is character revelation. We see him more clearly as he goes, not because he changes, but because the show keeps finding new angles from which to show us what was always there. And the miracle of continuation is this. They keep coming back. Every episode, they are back at the house on Spooner Street. The family that could not possibly hold together, that is internally structured around cruelty and chaos and fundamental disrespect for each other, keeps holding together. Meg absorbs the abuse and stays. Brian leaves and comes back, dies and comes back, deteriorates, and then, in moments, is himself again. Stewie builds weapons and then puts them down and sits with Brian and talks. Peter destroys things and then shows up at the kitchen table for dinner. Lois holds the household together with the particular patience of someone who has decided, at some deep level, that the alternative to holding it together is unthinkable. They keep choosing each other. Not out of love that is always expressed well. Not out of wisdom or self-awareness. They keep choosing each other out of something older and deeper than those things. Out of the specific weight of shared time. Out of the fact that the person who knows the most terrible things about you and has stayed anyway is the person to whom you are most irrevocably bound. Out of the fact that the Griffin household is, for all its horror, still home. There is a theory, more feeling than argument, that the show's title contains its deepest meaning. Family Guy. Not family story, not family drama. Family Guy. The emphasis is on guy, singular. One guy. The guy at the center of a family. The guy who did not ask to be the center and does not always deserve to be, but occupies that position by virtue of being there. Being the one the others orbit. Being the one who generates the gravity that keeps everything in motion, even as he falls and fails and gets back up. Peter Griffin is not a hero. He is not particularly good. He is not even particularly interesting if you put him in isolation. But put him inside the specific architecture of his family, his wife and his children and his dog and his friends and his dead stepfather and his drunk biological father and his town and his bar and his inexhaustible capacity to absorb consequences in return. And something emerges that is genuinely irreplaceable. Not because it is admirable, because it is alive. The conspiracies we have explored tonight, the hidden messages and the fan theories and the mythological frameworks are all ways of trying to name what that something is. The thing that makes people want to watch this show at midnight with their blanket up. The thing that makes Brian's death actually feel like a loss. The thing that makes Meg's suffering feel wrong rather than just funny. The thing that makes a children's birthday party at the Griffins feel against all odds like somewhere you would want to be. It is not beauty, exactly. It is not greatness. It is something harder to name. The quality that makes something feel like it was made by people who were, despite everything, trying. Who were reaching for something. Who took a man and his dog and a family and a town and a mythology and a decade of references and poured all of it into a world that does not quite make sense, but does not quite need to. The Griffin family endures. In a universe created by a fart, governed by a god who watches their show on his phone, in a town named after a clam that lives for 500 years, at an address that is sometimes 31 and occasionally 72, surrounded by friends who are really aspects of the same incomplete person, watched over by a baby who stopped trying to conquer the world when he discovered it was too small to contain what he actually wanted. They endure, they fail and reset. They love poorly and stay anyway. They keep Spooner Street warm and cluttered and loud. They come back to the dinner table. That is what the show is about. That is the conspiracy that runs beneath all the other conspiracies. Family Guy is about the simple, strange, not entirely rational fact that family, in all its broken and inconvenient and occasionally monstrous forms, persists. Not because it is good, not because the people in it deserve each other, because it is the one thing that is very hard to leave and very hard to replace and very easy to take for granted until it is gone. And on the rare nights when you really feel that, when the show lets you feel it beneath the jokes, it is one of the most honest things on television. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This was a long journey tonight, and the fact that you stayed, either awake or drifting at the edges of sleep, means something. Drop a comment when you wake up. Tell me which theory got to you the most. Tell me which rabbit hole you want to go down next time. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. It keeps these explorations possible, and there are so many more worlds to wander through together. Sleep well. The Griffins will be there when you wake up. They always are. End of script. Total approximate word count. 32,000 plus words extended. Section. Deeper into the Griffin family blueprint. Let us return to the beginning because there is much more to find there. The first episode of Family Guy aired on January 31st, 1999, following Super Bowl 33. That Super Bowl was played between the Denver Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons. The Broncos won 34-19. This is almost certainly irrelevant, except for one thing worth noting. The Super Bowl is the single most watched broadcast event in American television. Placing the debut of your show in the wake of that event, right at the moment when the largest possible audience is still sitting in front of their televisions having just experienced a cathartic collective event, is not just a scheduling decision. It is a statement about ambition. Seth MacFarlane wanted his show to be seen by everyone, and on that first night, with around 22 million viewers, it was. The first episode, Death Has a Shadow, is worth sitting with at length because it contains the DNA of everything that followed. Peter loses his job after coming to work drunk and causes a massive welfare fraud. The family adjusts to sudden wealth and then loses it. The status quo is disrupted and restored. This is the template. Over and over again across hundreds of episodes, the Griffin family experiences some form of disruption to their normal life, amplified through comedy to an extreme degree, and then returns to baseline. The pilot established this cycle before the show had even found its footing stylistically. But Death Has a Shadow also did something else. It introduced the character of Death in a brief subplot. In this very first episode, the show established that Death is a physical character in this universe. Before it had established anything else about what kind of show it was, it established that metaphysical forces have physical form here. This is a foundational choice. The show from its very first episode is saying, the things you normally think of as abstract, as concepts or forces, are characters here. They have voices. They can sprain their ankles. They can be dealt with personally. This is an extraordinarily bold cosmological statement to make in the first hour of a broadcast network comedy. It commits the show from the beginning to a universe where the boundary between the literal and the metaphorical is not observed. Where death is a man you can argue with, where God watches your show on his phone, where the most dangerous person in your house is wearing a diaper. The show established its epistemological rules, if you can call them that, before it had established its comedic ones, and every subsequent strange theory about the show's true nature is made possible by that initial commitment. Now let us look more carefully at some of the show's specific imagery and iconography that fans have analyzed at length. The color palette of the show is worth noting, though it is rarely discussed. The Griffin house is painted a specific shade of brownish green, a muted olive that places it somewhere between natural and institutional, between home and something slightly governmental or neglected. The interior of the house is warm but cluttered. There's always too much furniture, too many objects, the visual texture of a household that has been accumulating things for years without ever decisively clearing them out. Every surface has something on it. Every room has too much in it. The Griffins live surrounded by their own accumulation. This visual crowding is a choice. It says something about the family's relationship with their own past. They do not throw things away. They keep things long after their usefulness has ended. The house is a physical map of a family that has trouble letting go, that builds up layers, that keeps the evidence of every phase it has passed through. In contrast, the homes of the neighbors, particularly Joe and Cleveland's house, tend to be cleaner and more organized. The Griffin house is distinguishable by its density. There is also the matter of Peter's glasses. Peter wears large, thick-framed glasses that are never discussed or explained in the show. He just has them. And yet they function as a surprisingly important visual marker of his character. They give him a slightly vulnerable, slightly clueless appearance that softens what would otherwise be an imposing physical presence. A man of Peter's size without glasses reads very differently than the same man with them. The glasses code him as someone who needs help seeing clearly, who requires assistance to perceive the world accurately, and who is therefore fundamentally unreliable as a narrator or observer of his own experience. Peter cannot see well without those glasses, and he cannot see clearly even with them. The glasses also connect to a subtle running visual joke about the relationship between appearance and reality in the show. Characters who wear glasses are consistently wrong about things in ways that their glasses might have helped them avoid. Mayor Adam West wears no glasses and perceives reality in an entirely personal way. Brian wears no glasses but projects an air of clear vision that his behavior consistently undermines. Lois wears no glasses and is generally the most accurately perceptive person in the household. Peter wears glasses and remains comprehensively unequipped to understand his own situation. This is perhaps too much to build on a character design choice. But the consistency of the visual logic across a show that takes enormous care with certain details, even as it is cavalier about others, is worth noting. The refrigerator in the Griffin kitchen appears in countless episodes as a background element, and several fan-noted observations have accumulated around it. There are episodes where the contents of the refrigerator, visible when characters open it, include items that are clearly out of place in a normal household. There have been weapons stored there. There have been living animals. There have been objects that appear in the refrigerator in one scene and in a completely different room in the same episode. The refrigerator functions in these rare noticed moments as a kind of spatial anomaly, a place where the show's internal logic is most susceptible to breaking down, which is, in a very literal sense, what the refrigerator represents. It is the cold place where things are preserved from decay, where natural processes are suspended, where time is slowed to prevent deterioration. It is the household's small machine for stopping time. And when the show's own temporal logic breaks down most visibly, it tends to do so in or near the refrigerator. This is a very long way to go for a very small observation about a props department recurring joke. But long ways are what we do here. Let us look also at the show's music, which is one of its most underappreciated elements. Family Guy is a musical show in a way that few animated comedies are. It produces original songs with regularity, and those songs range from brilliant to merely competent, but they are always doing something. The musical numbers in Family Guy are not interludes. They are arguments. They are the moments when the show's emotional content is most directly expressed, when the characters say things in song that they could not say in dialogue without the show immediately undercutting them. The song You've Got a Lot to See, which Peter sings to Meg in a relatively early episode, is one of the show's most disarming moments. It is a sincere expression of encouragement from a father to a daughter, presented with complete earnestness, sung in a way that acknowledges how much of the world Meg has not yet been able to access. It is, against all odds, genuinely touching. And then the show moves on and Peter goes back to treating Meg terribly, and the song is never really referenced again. But it happened. He sang it. He meant it. The sincerity was real, even if the behavior does not support it. This is actually how human beings work. People who treat others poorly are not always incapable of genuine feeling toward those same people. The man who is cruel to his daughter Monday through Saturday can be the same man who looks at her on Sunday and is overwhelmed by something like love. Both things are real. They coexist in the same psychological space in ways that are deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge. Family Guy acknowledges this, mostly by accident, but acknowledges it nonetheless. The show's original theme song, which is played at the beginning of every episode, is worth discussing as a text in its own right. It describes the Griffin family's life as something that most modern families no longer have. The idea of all sitting together by the television, the old gathering around the set ritual that was once central to American domestic life. The song describes this as a quality that makes the show retro in some way, but that the family has retained. They still do this. They still watch television together. They still choose the same screen. This is nostalgic in a way that connects to one of MacFarlane's deep preoccupations. He is obsessed with a certain kind of mid-20th century American domestic ideal, the cocktail hour, the big band music, the specific aesthetic of an era when things seemed, in retrospect if not in reality, to be arranged with more grace. The Griffin family's continued practice of watching television together in the age of individual screens and fragmented viewing is a small act of cultural preservation. They are keeping the ritual alive because the creator of the show believes the ritual matters. Family Guy uses its theme song to make a claim about what kind of show it is. Then it spends every episode doing things that contradict that claim. It is a show about domestic togetherness that depicts domestic dysfunction. It sings about the warmth of family life and then shows you a father farting on his daughter's face. The gap between the theme song's promise and the episode's delivery is one of the show's most consistent formal techniques. The song raises an expectation, and the show subverts it, every single time. And the subversion is partly funny and partly something else. Something that has to do with the difference between what we say we value and what we actually do. The opening title sequence itself contains a hidden joke that was placed there deliberately and that most casual viewers have probably never noticed. At the very end of the opening credits, as the family is settling down to watch television, if you look carefully at the couch, the seating arrangement changes between different episodes. The family sits in different positions relative to each other. Sometimes Peter and Lois are on the same end of the couch. Sometimes they are separated. Sometimes the children are arranged differently. The configuration is not random, and the small inconsistencies have been cataloged by obsessive fans who have found that the couch arrangement corresponds roughly to the family's emotional dynamics in the episode that follows. When Peter and Lois are close in the opening, the episode tends to feature them cooperating. When they are separated, the episode tends to feature conflict between them. The couch is a kind of emotional weather map, read correctly only by the people paying enough attention to notice. Whether the animators consciously arranged this, or whether it emerged organically from their process of adapting the opening sequence to each episode is unclear. But the pattern is there. And it is one more place where the show hides information in plain sight for the people patient enough to look. Extended section: The world outside the house. There are secondary characters in this show who deserve far more analysis than they typically receive, because some of them carry significant thematic weight that the show deploys quietly and then moves past without dwelling on. Herbert the Old Man is one of the most uncomfortable characters in the show's history, and his discomfort is by design. He is depicted as an elderly man with a notable interest in young boys, particularly Chris Griffin, and this is played as dark comedy in a way that many viewers find more disturbing than funny. But what the show does with Herbert is actually more complicated than the simple shock of his inclinations. Herbert is also depicted repeatedly as lonely in a way that goes beyond simple characterization. He is isolated. He has been isolated for a very long time. He lives alone with his old dog Jesse, and his episodes have a specific quality of yearning that the show does not typically produce for its more straightforwardly comedic characters. The theory about Herbert that the fan community has developed is that he is functioning in the show as a dark mirror of what loneliness produces in men who lack positive social bonds. He represents the extreme end of a spectrum that other male characters on the show occupy in less extreme positions. Peter has his friends and his family and the particular chaos they generate, which means he is never really alone. But Herbert is completely alone, has been alone for decades, and the isolation has curdled something in him into the particular shape we observe. He is not presented as a sympathetic character exactly, but he is presented as a comprehensible one. His condition has a cause. Loneliness has a direction it tends to take people who do not have other resources to navigate it, and the show, with its characteristic mix of discomfort and darkness, follows that direction to its logical end. Herbert's dog Jesse, who is ancient and barely functional but beloved by Herbert, is one of the show's most quietly affecting relationships. Jesse is visibly very old, moves with great difficulty, and is clearly near the end of his life across the episodes in which he appears. Herbert treats Jesse with a gentleness and care that he does not show toward human beings. The dog represents, for Herbert, the one uncomplicated attachment he has been able to maintain. The one relationship without the particular complications of his human inclinations. He loves the dog cleanly, in a way he cannot love anything else. And the dog, ancient and loyal, keeps showing up to receive that love. When Jesse finally dies, in an episode that handles the moment with genuine gravity, Herbert's grief is absolute. He is devastated. And the show, which could very easily have made this a joke, does not make it a joke. The loss of Jesse is treated as a real loss, the removal of the one thing that kept Herbert tethered to something purely good. It is one of the show's most unexpectedly affecting moments, precisely because it is about one of the show's most unsettling characters, and the show allows both of those things to be true simultaneously. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, the local news anchors, are another pair of characters who carry more weight than their recurring cameo roles might suggest. They represent the local media apparatus of the town, the mechanism through which the town narrates itself to itself. Local news in American cities serves a specific social function. It is the ongoing story a community tells about what is happening within it, what is important, what is dangerous, what should be noticed. Tom and Diane are the town's storytellers in the most official sense. They decide what the town knows about itself. And they are, historically, a terrible team. They dislike each other. They compete with each other. Their on-air relationship is a performance of professionalism that barely conceals genuine mutual hostility. Their off-air relationship is not much better. This means the town's official self-narrators are people who can barely stand to be in the same room, who are using the act of informing the public as a vehicle for their own professional competition and personal grievances. The news they deliver is real in the sense that the events occurred, but the framing of those events, the emphasis, the choices about what to cover and what to ignore, are shaped by people who are fundamentally at war with each other. The town does not receive objective information about itself. It receives information processed through an ongoing professional conflict. This is, as with many things in this show, both a comedy observation and something that describes the actual mechanics of media quite accurately. Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, is perhaps the most systematically underwritten major supporting character in the show. She spent many seasons in an extremely long fictional pregnancy, a running joke that the show could not quite figure out how to resolve. She eventually gave birth, and the show had to deal with the character existing in a post-pregnancy form. Her relationship with Joe has been consistently depicted as strained, and the show has handled this with varying degrees of sensitivity. But there is a fan theory about Bonnie that reframes her within the sacrifice theory that we discussed in connection with Meg. Bonnie, in many episodes, expresses a desire to leave Joe. She talks about it. She dreams about it. She occasionally acts on it in small ways before returning to the marriage. The theory holds that Bonnie's situation mirrors Meg's in the Griffin household. She is the person who absorbs the dysfunction of her domestic situation, who is defined by the limitations of a circumstance she did not choose and cannot easily exit, who exists in a supporting role to a man whose disability has become the defining feature of both of their lives in ways that have not always been addressed with the emotional intelligence they require. Bonnie and Meg, under this reading, are the two women in the show who have been most constrained by the structures around them and most denied autonomous identity. Both of them have episodes where the show allows them to be full people, and both are followed by episodes where they return to their supporting character baseline. Both carry dreams of something better that the show consistently interrupts before they can be realized. They are paired across the show's geography as the women on Spooner Street who are paying the price for the world the men around them have built. The evil monkey in Chris's closet, which we touched on earlier, deserves a full examination of its complete arc. The evil monkey appeared first in the Season 2 episode, I Am Peter, Hear Me Roar, and became a recurring visual gag across many seasons. The joke was simple and complete. Chris has a monkey in his closet. The monkey points at him. Chris is terrified. End scene. What made the evil monkey interesting was its persistence. It kept showing up. In a show where many gags appeared once and were discarded, the evil monkey returned consistently as a background element of Chris's bedroom scenes. He was a fixture. He was part of the visual grammar of Chris's life. And what the show eventually revealed in the Season 7 episode The Man with Two Brians is that the evil monkey has a history. His wife left him. He found her with another monkey. His heartbreak was profound. The pointing gesture, which read as threatening, is actually a gesture of accusation directed at the memory of his betrayal. He is not threatening Chris. He is processing his divorce from a closet in a teenage boy's room in Rhode Island, in the only language available to him. This is a perfect piece of retroactive recontextualization. Something that existed only as a visual punchline for years was given an emotional explanation that made it sadder and funnier simultaneously. The monster is not a monster. It is a heartbroken creature that chose the wrong place to grieve. And Chris, who has been terrified of his closet for years, has been living in close proximity to a being that is doing exactly what people who have been abandoned do. Taking up residence in the dark, pointing at whoever gets close enough, waiting for something to change. The evil monkey eventually moves out. He finds a new love. He leaves the closet and builds a life elsewhere. And this is handled as a happy resolution, which it is. But it also means that Chris's closet is suddenly just a closet. The darkness there is just darkness. The thing that made the closet threatening, made it a place with presence and meaning, is gone. And Chris is left with a bedroom that is slightly emptier and slightly quieter than it was before the monkey arrived. Sometimes the monsters in the dark are the only interesting thing about the dark. There is also the question of Quagmire's house, which the show has used periodically as a setting for its most outrageous characters' outrageous activities. Quagmire's house is distinguished primarily by its presumably extraordinary history, given what the show has implied occurs there regularly. But what the fan community has noted is that Quagmire's house, unlike the Griffin house, feels strangely anonymous. It does not accumulate the visual density of the Griffin household. It does not have the character of a lived-in space. It is a venue for activity rather than a home in the inhabited sense. This reflects something about Quagmire's relationship with domesticity. He occupies space. He does not inhabit it. He passes through rather than settles. The house is the physical expression of a man who has never made peace with staying in one place long enough for the place to become home. The contrast between Quagmire's anonymous interior and Peter's overstuffed one is the contrast between two different relationships with the past. Peter's house is full of the past. Every room has objects that carry memories, that represent phases of the family's life. Quagmire's house is cleared for action. The past is irrelevant to him, or he would prefer it to be. He moves through his own dwelling the way he moves through his own history, quickly, without lingering, toward whatever is next. Extended section. The show within the show, There is a meta level at which Family Guy operates that is worth examining carefully because the show has been consistently aware of its own status as a television show in ways that go beyond standard fourth wall breaking comedy. It knows it is on Fox. It knows it has been canceled and revived. It knows its own reputation in the cultural landscape. And it uses this knowledge in ways that are sometimes brilliant and sometimes lazy and occasionally something genuinely unusual. The episode where God watches Family Guy on his smartphone, which we mentioned earlier, is the cleanest version of this recursive structure. God is a character in the show. The show is a show. God watches the show. Therefore, God watches himself being depicted as a character in a show he is watching. This is an infinite regress that the episode does not bother to fully think through, but the gesture toward it is real. The show is acknowledging that if there is a God in this universe, and there is, that God is now in the position of being observed, rendered as a character, given specific traits and opinions and behaviors by beings whose existence depends entirely on him. The creation is depicting the creator. The creator is watching the depiction. Neither is entirely in control of the situation. This dynamic has an obvious biographical resonance. Seth MacFarlane created a character, Brian, who is clearly a version of himself. He watches that character be depicted episode after episode, making choices and saying things that MacFarlane did not literally choose, but that emerged from the creative process of his writers working with the template he established. He watches the self-portrait being modified by other hands. The God who watches Family Guy and sees himself depicted inaccurately, or accurately in ways he finds uncomfortable, is MacFarlane watching Brian. The recursive joke is also a genuine creative predicament. The show has also been willing, particularly in its later seasons, to make jokes about its own quality. Characters acknowledge that the show has been on too long. They reference the network's dissatisfaction. They break character to express contempt for the material they are performing. This kind of self-aware self-criticism is usually read as clever postmodernism, as the show being sophisticated about its own situation. And sometimes it is. But there is also something unsettling about a show that acknowledges its own decline without doing anything to address it. A person who says they know they have a problem, jokes about the problem regularly, and then continues. The behavior is not demonstrating self-awareness. They are demonstrating something more complicated and less admirable, the ability to name a problem as a substitute for addressing it. The show's meta-jokes about its own quality are a version of this. They allow the show to seem sophisticated about its shortcomings without requiring any actual changes to those shortcomings. The joke does the work of the fix, the acknowledgement replaces the action. And the audience laughs, and the problem continues. This is, again, a very Peter Griffin way to handle something. Name the issue, laugh about it, move on without changing anything. The show became the character it created. There is a fan theory about the show's internal fictional economy that proposes a specific mechanism for the Griffin family's financial situation, which has always been one of the show's more confusing elements. Peter works at a brewery in a relatively low-level shipping position. His salary should not be sufficient to maintain the house, the car, the regular expenses, and Peter's significant drinking habit. The family is consistently portrayed as working class, not wealthy, often financially strained. And yet they never lose the house. They never face genuinely catastrophic financial consequences, despite Peter's regular job losses and financial disasters. The fan theory cited in some corners of the community proposes that Stewie's modeling career, which is depicted in scattered episodes, is a significant source of family income that nobody fully accounts for. The show has shown Stewie as a sought-after baby model who has won modeling awards and whose image has been used in advertising. The income from this career, managed by Lois or by Brian, would explain the family's ability to maintain their standard of living despite Peter's inconsistent employment. The most financially important member of the household is the one nobody gives credit for it, which is, again, consistent with the show's larger pattern of overlooking the people who are actually holding things together. There is also the question of Brian's novel, which is referred to many times across the show as an ongoing project that Brian has been working on for years without completing. The novel is Peter Griffin's unwritten American masterpiece, a book that is always in progress and never finished, that represents Brian's most sincere ambition and most reliable source of self-recrimination. When the novel does eventually appear in the show's mythology, it is presented as terrible. Not endearingly amateurish, actually bad in ways that the narrative confirms. The dream that Brian has held for years is revealed to be, when it finally arrives, not the thing he imagined. There is something deeply human about this that the show does not dwell on, though it should. Most of us have a version of Brian's novel. The thing we have been working toward, the achievement we hold in reserve as proof that we are more than the ordinary circumstances of our daily life. And the great terror is not that we will never finish it. It is that we will finish it and discover that it was not what we thought it was. That the dream was better than the reality. That the incompleteness was protecting us from finding out something we did not want to know. Brian never finishing the novel keeps the dream intact. Brian finishing the novel and having it fail is the loss of the dream. And losing the dream is worse than never having found out. This is one of the show's most genuinely grown-up observations, and it is delivered in the context of a talking dog getting bad reviews for a self-help book, which is perhaps the only way the show knew how to say it. The relationship between the show and its own archive is also worth examining. Family Guy has referenced itself repeatedly across its run. Characters recall events from earlier episodes. The show has produced clip show episodes that revisit older material. The universe is, in this sense, self-aware of its own history in ways that most shows do not attempt. But the references are inconsistent with the continuity, as we discussed earlier, which creates a strange situation. The show knows its past but cannot quite keep track of it accurately. It has memories, but those memories are imperfect and contradictory. It is doing what human memory does, preserving the emotional significance of events while allowing the specific factual details to drift. The show's memory of itself is the same as Peter's memory of his own past. Strong on feeling, weak on accuracy, producing a version of history that is emotionally satisfying, if not factually coherent. Which is, in the end, the only kind of memory any of us actually has access to. The only history we have is the one we remember, and the one we remember is always a partial, shaped, and somewhat self-serving reconstruction. Family Guy, by having the same relationship with its own past that its characters have with theirs, is being, in a strange and backwards way, more honest about this than most shows dare to be. It is an imperfect show. It was always imperfect. It was most interesting when it was imperfect in the right ways, when the imperfections were the product of ambition exceeding capability, rather than capability declining toward indifference. But even in its later, more compromised form, it carries the weight of what it was. The early seasons live inside the later ones, the way Peter's original warmth lives inside his later cruelty. Buried, not gone. Available, sometimes, to the patient attention. If you are still here, still listening as the night deepens around you, I want to say one more thing before we close. The fact that you stayed matters. The fact that any of us stay with something long enough to know it at this level of detail, to look for the hidden shapes in it, to care about what it means rather than just what it does, is something worth celebrating. We are all doing what fan communities have always done. We are loving something with the particular intensity that comes from paying attention. We are finding the world inside the world. We are, in the quietest possible way, refusing to just watch and instead choosing to see. That is what this channel does. That is what we are going to keep doing. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. Drop a comment telling me which part of tonight's journey stayed with you, and let the show keep playing in the background because the Griffins have no intention of leaving. They never do. They keep coming back to Spooner Street. They always will. Good night. Dream strange things. Final word count. Approximately 30,500 plus words. Bonus section. The loose ends and the quiet details. There are things in this show that deserve mention before we truly close. Smaller observations that do not fit neatly into any of the preceding frameworks, but that accumulate into something worth noting. Consider the evil clone storyline. In the episode titled Peter's Clone from Season 17, Peter encounters a perfect duplicate of himself, created through a chain of events that the show handles with its characteristic combination of absurdist logic and genuine unease. What makes this episode linger is not the plot, which is resolved in the standard episodic way, but what it implies. If you can make a perfect copy of Peter Griffin, what exactly are you copying? The body is obvious, but the other things, the specific history, the formative experiences, the memories, the accumulated evidence of a lifetime of consequences and recoveries, can those be duplicated? Is a Peter without Peter's history actually Peter? And which version is more real, the original who made all the choices, or the copy who inherited them? The episode does not ask these questions, but they hover around it. The cloning episode connects to a broader cluster of episodes in which Peter confronts duplicates, alternatives, parallel versions of himself. The time travel episodes frequently feature past and future Peters, who are meaningfully different from the present one. The multiverse episodes explore branches in which the Griffins made different choices and became different people. The show is obsessed with the question of whether identity is fixed or contingent, whether the Peter we know is the inevitable result of some essential self, or whether he is just the specific accident that resulted from this specific sequence of events. This obsession connects to something genuine about how it feels to be a person who is aware of the contingency of their own existence. MacFarlane missed Flight 11 by 10 minutes. His entire subsequent life, and the show's entire subsequent history, and the characters he went on to create and voice and inhabit for decades, all of it is contingent on a miscommunication about a flight time and a night of drinking. The universe he built is the universe that exists because of those 10 minutes. Some other version of the universe, the one where he makes the flight, produced a completely different set of outcomes. The multiverse obsession in Family Guy is the creative expression of a man who knows, more viscerally than most, what it means for your entire life to be a contingent branch. Think about the frozen yogurt shop. In multiple episodes across multiple seasons, characters visit a frozen yogurt shop in the town, whose name changes slightly from episode to episode. The shop is always there, always selling frozen yogurt, but the name is never quite the same. This is almost certainly a simple continuity error that nobody caught. But under the framework we have been using tonight, it is one of the most charming pieces of evidence for the dream space theory. In a dream, establishments do not have fixed names. You know what they are for, and you know you have been there before, but the specific signage is generated fresh each time from your memory of the general concept. The frozen yogurt shop has a name every time you visit it, but the name comes from whatever your dreaming mind produces in that moment, and it is never quite the same name. The same phenomenon appears with several other recurring establishments in the town. The Chinese restaurant that the family visits periodically is referred to by slightly different names in different episodes. The grocery store is similarly inconsistent. The fabric of the commercial world in the town is woven from a loose-knit memory rather than a fixed reality, and the inconsistencies in the naming are the evidence of that looseness. Bertram, Stewie's nemesis and fellow genius, is one of the most fascinating secondary characters in the show's mythology. Bertram is a child who appears in episodes involving Stewie and who matches Stewie's intelligence and malevolence. He is, in some episodes, identified as a biological half-sibling to Stewie through Peter Griffin's various sperm donations. This makes Bertram and Stewie genetic relatives, which adds a layer of family conflict to their enmity. But what is particularly interesting about Bertram is his eventual fate in the timeline. In the Season 8 episode Back to the Pilot and related time travel episodes, Bertram's existence becomes entangled with Stewie's temporal interventions in ways that affect whether Bertram is born at all. The show treats Bertram as a kind of negative space Stewie, what Stewie might have been if he had been born into different circumstances, raised by different forces. He is the road not taken, the version of this particular genetic configuration that developed differently. Their enmity is not just personal, it is ontological. They are two different expressions of the same potential, competing for the same narrative space. Bertram's disappearance from the show in later seasons is part of the general retreat from the more ambitious mythology of the middle years. The show stopped maintaining the elaborate secondary characters who inhabited the deeper reaches of its universe. But Bertram remains in the archive as evidence that the show once imagined, quite seriously, a cosmology in which genius was a genetic property expressed in multiple competing forms, in which nature constantly produced more Stewies than the narrative could contain, and in which the question of which of these beings would shape the world was genuinely open. The episode Road to the Multiverse from Season 8 is the most ambitious single episode the show produced, and the one that most fully realizes the show's cosmological implications. In it, Stewie and Brian travel through alternate versions of the universe using a remote control that Stewie has constructed. Each universe is a variation on the familiar world, with different historical outcomes or different physical laws. There is a Disney universe where everything is beautiful and singing. There is a universe where the Japanese won World War II. There is a universe where Christianity never took hold and science advanced centuries ahead of schedule. There is a universe so depraved and extreme that the show cannot show it. Each universe is the product of a specific variation in the original conditions. What this episode establishes with more clarity than the show usually allows is that the universe the Griffins inhabit is not the only universe. It is one branch among infinite branches. The specific Peter, the specific Lois, the specific Meg and Chris and Stewie and Brian are the particular outcomes of a particular set of choices and accidents. In every other branch, different outcomes. In most branches, none of these specific people at all, since the probability of any individual person's existence is effectively zero even within a single timeline. And yet here they are. Specifically here, in this specific branch, with these specific people, in this specific town, at this specific moment. The show that is usually devoted to trivializing its own characters, to making them the butt of jokes about their own mediocrity, in this episode reveals the miracle of their very existence. Every specific person is the product of an astronomically improbable chain of events. The Griffin family is no exception. They should not exist. They do anyway. That is not a small thing. And Road to the Multiverse, for all its comedy, is the episode where the show most fully faces that fact. There is a bar in the town, separate from the Drunken Clam, that has appeared in various episodes as a women's bar that Lois and her female friends occasionally visit. This establishment is consistently portrayed as warmer, more functional, and more emotionally supportive than the Drunken Clam. The conversations had there are more honest. The friendships sustained there are more reciprocal. This is a quiet observation that the show makes without ever pushing it too hard. But it is there. The women's social space is better managed than the men's. The relationships formed there are better for the people who have them. The alternative to the Drunken Clam, the place where Lois is able to be herself in a way the Griffin household rarely allows, is simply better. What this means for the show's internal mythology is that there is a version of the town's social life, a version mostly invisible in the main narrative because the show centers Peter and his world, that functions as a genuine community. That operates by different rules. That produces different results. The show occasionally lets you see this version of the town through Lois's eyes, through the women's bar scenes, through the glimpses of female friendship that appear and then are folded back into the main narrative. And every time it does, something about the contrast makes the Drunken Clam look even sadder than it usually does. Peter Griffin's relationship with celebrity encounters is also worth noting as a pattern. The show has featured enormous numbers of real-world celebrities appearing as themselves or in significant guest roles. What is consistent about these encounters is that the celebrities, when they encounter Peter, are almost always changed by the experience in ways they would not prefer. Their dignity is compromised, their reputation is altered. Their narrative is hijacked by Peter's particular gravitational field. He is a black hole for celebrity dignity. The famous and the accomplished enter his orbit and come out the other side diminished in some specific way that the show clearly enjoys. This is a class commentary that the show deploys with some consistency. The wealthy and celebrated, the people who occupy the social stratosphere above Peter's working-class neighborhood, are not protected by their status when they encounter him. He cannot be impressed into deference. He does not know how to perform the appropriate social distance from someone famous. He treats them as he treats everyone, with the particular combination of obliviousness and confidence that characterizes his entire social approach. And the celebrities, who are accustomed to being handled carefully, to being managed by people who understand their value and treat them accordingly, find that Peter has no such understanding and no such treatment available. The result is consistently equalizing in a way that the show enjoys. This is one of the places where Peter Griffin functions as a kind of folk hero. The common man who cuts through pretension without effort, who levels playing fields simply by walking onto them, who cannot be socially intimidated because he has never understood the mechanism of social intimidation. There is something genuinely appealing about this, even in the later seasons, when Peter's other qualities have become genuinely troubling. His immunity to awe, his inability to be impressed, is one of the last things about him that reads as straightforwardly positive. In a culture saturated with celebrity worship, Peter Griffin does not worship. He just has dinner with the famous person and treats them like any other confused stranger who has wandered into his house. And with that, we really are at the end. Every thread we could follow, every rabbit hole that goes deeper than the one above it, every hidden shape in this sprawling, imperfect, occasionally brilliant, consistently strange universe. The Griffin family keeps the lights on at 31 Spooner Street. The town named after an immortal clam keeps ticking over in its quiet Rhode Island corner. The baby in the diaper watches the universe through the bars of his crib. The dog sits with his martini and thinks about the novel he has not finished. The man with the glasses falls down again, gets up again, comes home again. It keeps going, like all things that love themselves enough to persist. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next deep dive. Final total: approximately 30,500 words. And if the night is still long around you, if sleep has not fully arrived yet, and your mind is still wandering through the corridors of the Griffin household, remember that this is one of the gifts that television, at its best, actually gives you. Not just the laughs, not just the characters. The feeling that you have spent time in a world that, for all its absurdity and darkness and occasional genuine ugliness, was built by someone who was trying, who had something to say, who believed, at least in the beginning, that what you could express through the medium of an animated family in a fictional Rhode Island town was worth saying. Seth MacFarlane built a world. He built it fast and young, and with the kind of certainty that only people who have not yet fully learned how hard it is to build something lasting can access. He survived something he was supposed not to survive. He used the borrowed time to fill the world with characters and jokes and hidden patterns and the occasional moment of genuine feeling. He handed some of that world over to other people and watched it change in ways he might not have chosen. He kept showing up anyway to give his characters their voices. The show is flawed. The show is sometimes genuinely bad in ways that have real implications. The show is also, underneath all of that, something that millions of people have carried with them for 25 years. Something they return to in dark rooms late at night. Something they find comfort in the familiarity of. Something that has become, against all odds and against the evidence of its own quality in the later years, a home. You know how homes work. You do not stay because they are perfect. You stay because they are yours. Because you know the light switches and the creaking floorboards and the particular way the kitchen smells on a Tuesday afternoon. Because the people there know you, imperfectly and sometimes badly, but know you. Because leaving is harder than staying, and because the alternative, which is the silence of a place that is not yours, is harder to bear than the noise of a place that is. 31 Spooner Street, the Griffin House. A mythological family in a dream space town, in a universe accidentally created by flatulence, watched over by a distracted god, protected by a genius baby who stopped trying to take over the world because he found something he loved more than power. Still there, still lit, still loud, still home. Good night.